Hey, what's up? It's Cute What If. This side. Today we will be seeing, what if Deku joins Galactic Federations Sentients? Now before we move ahead with the FIC, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for future what ifs like this. Aizawa didn't know what higher entity they had upset to get them into this situation. It was meant to be a simple practice drill for the cadets. An exercise meant to familiarize them with flying and running retrieval operations in asteroid belts and other areas with large space debris. It cracking figures that his class would have the misfortune of somehow picking the same belt as Overhaul, the most wanted sentient trafficker on this side of the Meridium galaxy. It's not like there are billions upon billions of other debris fields the man could have chosen to occupy. As a result of their massive misfortune, Aizawa and one of his students had been nabbed and thrown into a cell. Katsuki being the one grabbed along with him. On the one hand, the Trinitrox was one of the best to have kidnapped alongside him. The kid was an S-class species who came from a death planet, planets that most species would find uninhabitable. As a result, Trinitroxes were well known and well feared, especially for their combat prowess and ability to secrete flammable materials. On the other hand, the kid, like most of his species, was incredibly short-tempered, meaning he was bound to escalate the situation and upset their captors at any given moment. Aizawa sighed, whiskers and ears twitching, as he tilted his felon-esque head towards the student. For red eyes studied the kid carefully. The boy was stewing grumpily in the corner, running his taloned hands up and down his shoulders intermittently. As a reptilian race, the kid didn't have much protection against the cool room. While his orange and black scales served as decent armor against attacks, they did not shield him from the cold. The jagged tufts of blonde feather-like fur and horns on his head and down his back did little in the way of protection either. Because of the lingering cold, he was also unable to use his natural defenses. Katsuki was too prideful to seek the warmth of his teacher's black-furred form, which was a major issue since Aizawa wanted to keep them both in prime condition to solidify their chances of escape. Also, since he was concerned about the consequences prolonged exposure to cooler temperatures could have on his student. All attempts to goad him over were unsuccessful. The teen would rather gouge his own eyes out with his short claws than stoop to cuddling with his instructor. That also didn't take into account problem number 2. The small pulvis youngling that had been in the cell before they were introduced. The small creature was bipedal like her new cell mates, though she wasn't a digitigrade like them. Her skin and hair was pearlescent white with a singular plant matter horn poking from the left side of her forehead. Pulvis were incredibly rare, so she was likely worth quite a lot to the traffickers. Her monochromatic coloring was odd for her species as well, as they often had shades of green and purple, so she was probably even more valuable. Her species, while known for their ability to wick moisture, of any kind, out of anything living or not, were not considered overly dangerous. It took a long while for them to do serious damage with their abilities, and not all species had high concentrations of fluid. They were a plant-adjacent species and fairly peaceful, not prone to violence in the slightest. Their more plant-like nature also meant the species was largely hermaphroditic and capable of reproducing by themselves without a partner. The girl, Eri, had been terrified of them at first, but she quickly warmed up, finding camaraderie and safety in their presence for the past few days. The three of them had developed a schedule in that time. Wake up, get nutrient slurry tossed at them, huddle up against the walls, try to stave off boredom, take a shot at persuading Katsuki to join his and Eri's cuddle corner, get violently rejected, then instead convince the teen to take a jacket Aizawa had warmed up with his own body heat. Over and over. Spaced in between those activities was sporadic sleeping and quiet plans of escape. They weren't sure when or if help would make it to them. This all changed on the 4th day when 3 of their guards came wheeling down the hall, barking at each other in basic. They were not a species Aizawa was overly familiar with, though they were large and burly with a set of large primary arms and smaller, almost stick-like secondary arms. Their skin seemed to have a natural plating too in dull grays and blacks. They painted markings onto those rough plates, long external lines accompanied by geometric swirls. From what Aizawa had gathered, the species women tended towards red paints and the men towards purples. The strength of this decorated natural armor was as of yet unknown to Aizawa. What does he cracking expect us to do with this thing? All of the cells are full. It'll probably kill anything we stick it with, one of them griped. I bet you the rumors about this thing are just rumors. It's got no claws or fangs, it's probably harmless. Just stick it in with the pardus, trinitrox, and pulvis. The other interjected. It's a meat eater, right? So the pulvis will be fine if it stays out of the way. The pardus and trinitrox were accidental acquisitions too, so it probably doesn't matter if they get hurt. The other grumbled back. The two stopped in front of their cell, a table with a hanging floor between them with something laying on it. All the cell's occupants perked up, watching as one of the brutes punched away at the door's keypad. Both Aizawa and Katsuki tensed, considering seizing this opportunity to escape. They were dissuaded from doing so when another brute brandished one of their stun sticks at them, the end arcing menacingly with electricity. The metal barred door hissed open as the locks disengaged and the other two wheeled the table in. Using their smaller arms, they unhooked the four and removed the mystery creature from the table. However, their broad backs blocked the creature from its new cellmate's view. Finally, they dropped the creature against the wall and swiftly wheeled out. As they went by, Aizawa stole a glance at the four-bag. Though strong to read in the low lighting, he managed to make out the words Loro printed on the label. Whatever this creature was, it was likely to be out for a long while. His thoughts were interrupted when he heard Katsuki gasp slightly, a very uncommon and concerning sound for the teen. "That's a human!" the kid exclaimed, red eyes wide with confusion. Aizawa jerked his head to the side, his black mane slapping against his cheeks as he rushed to get a glimpse of the creature. The sight that met him filled his gut with an uncertain pit. His student was right, it was undoubtedly a human. Squishy-looking tan skin covered with strange dots, hands tipped with rounded nails, large forward-facing eyes, and a patch or hair on top of their head. Oddly enough, this human's hair was blackish-green. Aizawa didn't know if that was common or not, but it certainly made the human look like they had a curly bush on their head. Taking a slow, deliberate breath, the man squeezed his eyes shut to collect himself for a brief moment. He could already tell the situation was going to be an absolute mess. "Yes, Katsuki, that appears to be a human." The man sighed, which means this situation just got all the more dangerous. Both kids peered over at him curiously. So he elaborated, "As you know, humans are a new addition to the Galactic Federation's lexicon of species. We knew of them for many eclipses, but chose to avoid contact with them till we a better understanding. Unfortunately, the notorious Syndicate Alfroon decided they wanted to take advantage of this new species and attempted an invasion. No one knows what happened during that invasion exactly. What we do know is that in the end the humans devastated their invading force, then quickly cannibalized and improved the tech the Alfroon troops brought with them. The few survivors of that invading force are said to be haunted by what they witnessed on that planet." The man paused, softly patting Eri to comfort her. "I'm not saying this to scare you too, but we must proceed with caution. After that incident, the Galactic Federation was forced to start communications with the humans, and it was a rocky road trying to convince them we meant no harm. In the 10 eclipses, since we have not learned a lot about humans, they are too rare and reclusive. They have certainly never let anyone even close to their home world again. What we do know is that despite their appearances, they are incredibly aggressive, incredibly violent, and incredibly dangerous. They are an S-class sapient, and much like Katsuki, we have determined they come from a death planet." Aizawa heard Katsuki scoff from the other corner. "As if that stupid hairless creature could be dangerous?" Aizawa rumbled scoldingly, "This is serious, Katsuki. We are locked in a cell with an unknown threat. You will not antagonize the human, do you hear me?" The man left no room for argument, and in a rare show of espionage the teen broke eye contact. The slight head turn and baring of his neck caused his horns to scrape lightly against the metal walls. They sat in heavy silence for a few moments, Aizawa silently comforting the now trembling Eri as they stared at the slumped firm across from them. It was only minutes later when they noticed the human's breathing had picked up slightly, still slow but not as lethargic as it had been before. Minutes after that, Aizawa watched in confusion and a slight touch of horror as the creature stirred awake. They had the human on Loro. How was it awake so fast? Tan eyelids peeled back to reveal vibrant green eyes. Black pupils constricted before expanding across the green iris as they drifted blearily across the room. Suddenly those eyes connected with Aizwa. They were all witness to a full-body JRK as the human jolted back into awareness. In an instant the human was on their feet, eyes darting from each occupant and back again. Both Aizwa and Katsuki tensed, subtly shifting so they were ready should the human choose to attack. The human was very clearly agitated and they didn't know what it would do. When the human's eyes lingered on Eri for a moment too long, Aizwa pushed her protectively behind him, causing the human gaze to shift solely to him. Its eyes stared straight into Aizwa. A move that was a blatant show of aggression and demps when done with a stranger. The man was taken a little aback by the bold move. Unlike Eri too, the human seemed to have no trouble seeing them clearly in the dimly lit room. This was an important piece of information the man tucked away. He contemplated using the suppression abilities his kind were known for to try and de-escalate. However, there was no knowing how the human would respond to the mind tricks. It could only end up making the entire situation worse. Suddenly the human broke eye contact with him, a strange babbling escaping its lips as its eyes darted to the cell around them. Weirdly, Aizwa didn't feel like he had won the posturing match. It felt more like the creature simply lost interest and moved its attention elsewhere. The babbling continued, and the human's expression pinched as it wandered over to the door, inspecting with critical eyes before turning to Aizwa and burbling at him in what the man felt was a questioning manner. "I don't understand what you are saying," the man stated as calmly and soothingly as he could. The sound of his voice seemed to give the creature pause as it turned its attention back to him, head tilted curiously. It made a few soft sounds under its breath. It almost sounded like it was mimicking Aizawa's words. Then it turned back to the bars and peered through. Hands gripped the bars as it pressed its face against the bars and tried to peer into the hallway as if it heard something. It was only then that Aizwa realized he heard something too, the sound of feet shuffling down the hall pushing something with a familiar creaky wheel. It was the sound of the food cart. "You should step away from the bars before they get here." The man knew there was no point in saying it. The human didn't seem to understand a lick of basic, but he would feel bad if he didn't at least try. Sure enough, the human only turned back around to look at him, chirping inquisitively and eyes lacking comprehension. Aizwa grew nervous the closer the cart drew. The human, despite its boldness, had not been physically aggressive with them as of yet. It appeared as though they had caught it in a somewhat docile mood, Demp's displays notwithstanding. But the man didn't know what would happen once the guard that came to deliver their food decided to antagonize it. The guard wouldn't be the one locked in the cell to deal with the fallout. At least Aizwa could count his blessings that Katsuki had opted to stay silent so far, choosing instead to quietly observe the human. When the cart creaked to a stop, the guard scowled at them. "Back up," he rumbled. The human made no move, instead eyed the creature critically. That constant stream of babbling it was doing earlier kicked up again. In the hopes of averting disaster, Aizwa spoke up. "The human doesn't speak basic." This was evidently the wrong thing to say since a cruel gleam entered the guard's eye and faster than a comet, they lashed out with their stun stick. Shockingly, the human seemed to have picked up on the ill intent and dodged backwards. They weren't fast enough to completely escape the weapon though, as it connected solidly with one of the human's digits. They yelped with surprise as their muscles spasmed and locked up briefly before loosening up again. In response, the brute laughed cruelly, though a little uneasily, as the human landed steadily on the ground, sure-footed as they observed their burned finger before simply sticking it in their mouth. It was an oddly animalistic thing to do, but what was more surprising was how quickly the human brushed off the shock. Sure, they only had a small point of contact, but that contact should have been to transfer enough electricity to at least knock the air out of the human's lungs. The guard covered up their unease with a bark of laughter. "Good thing pain is a universal language." They sneered before bending over to shove some trays of slop and a few bottles of fluid through the slot on the floor of their barred cell door. The human watched them go with a scowl on their face and fingers still firmly placed in their mouth, those eyes smoothly tracking their movements. Now they were stuck in a cell with an irritated human. An irritated human who was still standing between them and their one meal for the day. Great. He turned looking down at Eri, who stared longingly at the trays and felt his heart pinch. Typically, as a plant-based life form, Eri did not need to consume much food. However, since they were currently cut off from actual light from stars, she needed actual food to substitute. However, he didn't want to agitate the sleeping beast that was the human. He also didn't want his two charges to starve. He needed to find a way to communicate and peacefully get their share. Starting unnecessary fights and nurturing animosity would do them no favors here. In an unlikely show of cosmic good fortune, the universe took pity on them. The human looked down at the trays, nose twitching. They seemed rather disinterested with the food. The only thing they really took an interest in was one of the fluid bottles. After some inspection, they swiped up one of the bottles to keep for themselves. Just as the human began to turn away from the food, it paused and turned back to look at them. Green tracked their faces and followed their gazes to the food. Understanding lit the human's eyes as they stared back down at the gray slop. The human chattered as they knelt over and placed their hands near the edge of the tray. Then, to the three's immense surprise, it gave each tray a firm push, sending them sliding across the floor to the three other occupants. They even slid their own portion across the floor towards them. Fluid bottles followed shortly after, skidding noisily across the textured flooring. It was such an unexpectedly kind act, which was immediately confused when the human curled their lips up and bore their teeth at them. Eri cried in fright, with her two older companions tensed at the sudden threat. Katsuki also seemed to lose his tight control and growled in return. Their reaction seemed to surprise the human, as instantly the threatening teeth disappeared and it chirped at them. Its expression seemed surprised. Aizawa didn't know, though he began to wonder, was that actually an aggressive action? Was it a veiled threat? Or was it something else entirely? Then the human stood up and moved to the opposite corner of the room. They curled up in a ball and hid behind their knees, eyes locked firmly onto the metal door. It appeared as if the human was telling them they were done interacting. The rest of the day passed quietly after they finished their meals, the other three splitting the human's share among them. The green, mostly hairless sentient across from them only partook in the fluid bottle. The human would occasionally shoot them small glances before turning their attention back to the barred door. Each guard that passed by was stared down by the human, studying their every move. Katsuki had slowly drifted closer and closer to Aizawa, establishing a more unified front should the human decide to attack. The space also allowed them to exchange words quietly as the human silently stalked their captors with its gaze. Soon they all began to drift off, with only Aizawa and the human remaining awake. Katsuki was finally able to get some good sleep now that he was sharing his instructor's body heat, so the man was grateful for that. Aizawa fought to stay awake and keep watch though. To his surprise, the human showed no signs of drifting off. Their green eyes remained open and alert across from him. The sleep cycle passed in an eerie silence, with only the occasional guard. Aizawa knew that the new cycle had started when he began to see more guards. The human seemed to take notice too, perking up slightly. Eri and Katsuki had woken up a little while later. They seemed tired still, but were awake and alert nonetheless. That was when it all went wrong. Shortly after everyone was awake, a cart passed by collecting all the cell's trays. Aizawa had stacked theirs by the cell door, wanting to avoid them collecting and starting to smell. To his confusion, though, the human had gotten up to swipe one after he had set them down. The collector didn't seem to notice or care when they picked up the trays, and none of them were going to point it out, even if it was a weird thing for the human to hoard. Closely behind the collector was a group of 4 guards. They stopped in front of the cell. They glared at each other, seeming to argue quietly before one was pushed forward. "We are here to collect the pulvis for overhauls testing. Do not attempt to interfere or you will be punished," he growled. Eri cried out as she slid behind Aizawa and Katsuki for protection. The other two were on their feet in front of her, rumbling lowly in warning. The commotion seemed to intrigue the human too, as they peered with squinted eyes between the sentients in the cell with them and the sentients that were opening the cell door. 2 of the guards stepped into the cell. "Send over the pulvis," one ordered, brandishing its stun stick with malice. No, Aizawa and Katsuki barked in response. Eri's cries rose in volume as she clung to her saviors desperately. The brutes approached, ready to attack. Large arms gripping their weapons tightly and their smaller set of arms extending out, prepared to catch Eri should she run. Both guards took a swing at the obstacles in their way. Due to Eri's clinging and the wall behind them, Aizawa and Katsuki, they weren't able to dodge too well. They held out for a moment, ducking and weaving attacks before Katsuki took a hit to the abdomen. The teen crumpled to the floor with a cry of agony. Aizawa roared with rage as he moved to protect his student from another attack, only to have Eri snatched out from under him. Aizawa swiped a clawed hand at the offender, trying to pull Katsuki out of danger as he pursued the guard who was roughly hauling Eri away. All of this came to a screeching halt when a food tray sailed through the air and shattered across the guard holding Eri's face. The brute had barely had time to recover from their stumble when a green blur barreled into him. The human had come to their aid. In a surprisingly acrobatic display, the human scaled the much larger creature's back, all the while howling and hissing at their prey. With a raised fist, the human punched across the side of the brute's face. The guard cried out in pain as the human swung again. The guard released Eri, who scampered back to the relative safety of Aizawa. Fortunately for them, the other guards weren't moving, only watching in shock and horror as the human lashed out. The guard with the human on his back tried to reach an arm over his shoulder to pry the human off, only to immediately regret it as the human promptly bit down on the invading appendage. Everyone present flinched as the guard's hand crunched and spurted blood when the human crushed them between their jaws. The human didn't let go. With a mouth full of mangled hand, the human continued to bear down on the guard's head. Any attempts to dislodge them were fruitless. Even when the guards slammed their back against a wall, the human continued to cling and land punch after punch, each heavy impact accompanied by a cry of pain. After 6 hits, the guard was on his knees. At this moment, the other guard in the cell took a step to intervene. All this accomplished was redirecting the human's wrath. The human leapt off their captive's back, swiping up the stun stick as they went and sticking it into the bleeding brute. Electricity surged through their large form. They jumped and seized violently before finally collapsing. Slowly, the human turned, eyes wide and pupils dilated as they locked on to the next guard. Their face was painted with yellow blood, and through their sneer bits of flesh could be seen stuck in their teeth. The guard took a lurching step back, a step that was swiftly matched by the human. Though the human didn't charge, it seemed to be waiting for something. The guard's gaze darted to their partner, terrified. They let their gaze dart over to Eri, as if considering she was worth it. The human took exception to that. The human forward swing the stun stick around and bludgeoning the guard's knee. It crumpled under the impact. The guard took a wild swing with their stun stick as they went down, only for the attack to sail over the human's ducking head. Then the human slammed the baton against their elbow, once again avoiding shocking them, instead going for brutal blunt force trauma. The guard dropped their stun stick and crumpled to the ground. They reached out for their weapon, only for it to be kicked away by the human. Scrambling back, the guard began to plead with the human. Rumors and myths about humans swirled in their head. Stop. They were interrupted when the human barked something in their language at them. The human very deliberately pointed at their fellow on the ground, then pointed at the door where the other 2 guards sat watching in terror through the now closed cell door. When the brute didn't immediately move, the human stomped their foot, looming closer, barking the same words and gesturing again. The guards seemed to finally pick up on the human's desires as they wobbled hurriedly to their feet and limped over to collect their friend, the whole way never completely turning their back to the human as they dragged the miming guard to the cell door, begging the whole while for the door to be opened. When all the guards were safely out for the cell and the door was firmly shut, they stopped to stare at the human, like a prey animal freezing before its doom. The human glared right back and bared their teeth in a sneer, the inside and outside of their mouth still stained with yellow blood. That same yellow stained their fists, though the torn flesh there was leaking red, resulting in a grisly orangish tone. The human hissed at them and spat some of that blood at them. The action sent the guards scurrying away with their metaphorical tails between their legs. The cell was silent in the aftermath. Eri and Aizawa stared up at the human. They had ducked low to avoid swing limbs and to help their fallen comrade while the human went berserk. Even Katsuki, who was still recovering from the attack he received, was wide-eyed, his scaly maw open in surprise. The teen was impressed, though he would never admit it out loud. The human turned, looking down at them. Their CST expanded and contracted at a slightly higher rate. Their pupils, still blown wide, settled on the sentients before them. Aizawa grappled with an explanation for what just happened. Was that a territorial display? If so, why hadn't the human done the same with them when they were introduced? Did they somehow accidentally give a proper reaction that convinced the human their territory wasn't being threatened? But then why? Aizawa's thoughts came to a screeching halt when Eri peeled away from him and bolted to the BLD-coded human before them. Panic jolted through Aizawa and Katsuki as the girl slipped away. Both of them tried to grab her as she ran past, but both missed. They could only watch in fear as the little girl quickly gathered her courage and crashed into the human's knees, grasping the fabric on their legs tightly. "Thank you," she yelled, the fear inhibiting her ability to control her volume. The human jolted, bracing easily against the impact as they peered down at her. They took a step back, knelt down, and placed a hand on her head, smoothing out the ruffled hair in her head. Soft cooing words escaped the human's lips as their mouth once again tilted upwards and the human bared their teeth. The girl's two companions simultaneously tensed. "Eri," Aizawa stated urgently but quietly to avoid upsetting the human, "back away slowly. Don't show them your back or they might attack." The literal girl looked back at them, expression stubborn. "Aizawa, I don't think they're mean. The face they're making is different from the one he was making at the bad guys," she declared, a small pale finger reaching up to point at the human's face. When he was glaring at them, his lips pointed down and the fur above his eyes got all scrunchy. To prove her point, she hesitantly poked the human's cheek, causing them to let out a light, almost amused, huffing sound. Until, that is, they noticed the BLD on her finger. The girl noticed at the same time, and before she could get upset or scared, the human gently cradled her hand and wiped the yellow stain off with the white shirt it wore under its soft-looking coat. "She's right," Katsuki suddenly rumbled. "Their expression is different. I think they are called eyebrows? Their eyebrows are higher on their face and their mouth is set differently. It might not be aggressive." He pointed as he spoke, tone as gruff as ever. The expression slipped off the human's face as it looked between Eri and Katsuki, expression scrunched in what looked like confusion before something seemed to dawn on them and their hand shot up to conceal their BLD-covered mouth and chin. Their cheeks began to turn a curious pink color. The human, still kneeling before Eri, quickly shrugged off its jacket, then tugged off its shirt, using the hem of the cloth to wipe the fluid from their face. They also ran their tongue over the cloth, face screwing up as if they were suddenly reminded of how horrible the BLD and tissue in their mouth tasted. Underneath the shirt, the human was incredibly muscular. The little dots that marked their face covered the rest of their arms and torso. Their body was also littered with scars, with a large concentration of them existing on their right arm, where there rested a few jagged lines and a large discolored patch high up on the limb. If they hadn't witnessed the human's battle prowess, these scars certainly would have been a good indicator. After realizing there wasn't much more they could do to clean their face, the human tossed the shirt to the unoccupied corner. Eri watched the move with avid curiosity. "He's got so many marks on him. What are the dots on his skin?" "I don't know, Eri. But maybe you should take a few steps back just in case. They might be nice now, but you saw how quick they turned on those guards with no warning or reason," Aizawa cautioned as he and Katsuki inched closer to the girl. "I think there was a reason," the girl said softly back, gazing up at the crouching human who had turned away from her and was now picking up the pieces of the shattered tray. Humans seem to have weirdly short attention spans. "I think they did it to save us," Eri said as the other two settled protectively next to her. Watching as the human sorted through the shards, placing larger jagged pieces in one pile and smaller rounded ones in another, the human seemed to ignore the stun sticks for now. They lay an arm's length away from them as the sentient worked. Thinking back on it did make sense. The human had been quiet until they had been attacked. No one had wanted to bother them and see if the rumors about humans were true, though his first-hand experience firmly showed him that the rumors were in some small way accurate. At least as far as their violence goes, since the humans' attacks were particularly vicious. The real question was, why did the human feel the need to help? They wouldn't have had anything to gain from helping them. Yet they risked getting hurt or worse. Unless this wasn't about personal gain. Perhaps the human realized that it was in the presence of younglings? It's entirely possible humans have strong instincts to protect young, and both of his charges could technically fall into that category. It would explain why the human didn't really react until both of the younglings were truly in danger. There was also the fact that the human had given up their own food for them. Maybe another move motivated by an instinctual need to care for younglings? Katsuki scoffed. We didn't need saving, they were just butting their ugly fleshy nose where it didn't belong. There was the boy's infamous pride again. It was honestly astounding that he had restrained himself this long. Green curls bounced as the human looked up at Katsuki's aggressive declaration. The human said a few things to the team, then went back to rifling through his items. Now it seemed he had moved on to poking curiously at the batons. As much as Aizawa would love to protest that he'd rather not mess with the human's amiable mood. If the human capable of subduing two opponents over twice his size wanted to investigate, he was not going to be the one to tell him to knock it off. Eri watched the human as they turned the devices over in their hands. They pressed the trigger on the side and yelped in surprise when the electricity visibly arced between the prongs on the tip. What do you think they're doing? She asks. Aizawa stared tiredly at the human, her eyes blinking slowly before replying, I have absolutely no idea. As long as it doesn't hurt us, I don't really care. They all sat in silence, observing the human as they tinkered with the batons. Though it didn't last long since they eventually seemed to lose interest. Setting the two weapons back on the ground, they collected their shards of tray, stained shirt, and coat before retreating back to their corner. There the human turned to face the corner, showing the group their back as it fiddled. The sound of tearing fabric and two strong surfaces grinding together filled the space. Aizawa eyed the human as they tinkered. His gaze flickered to the stun sticks, lost deep in thought as he contemplated their next move. Katsuki, he grunted. Think you could use those to make something that would break down the door? A vague gesture was thrown in the direction of the two stun sticks. While not usually one to encourage his students' pyromaniac or demolition-oriented tendencies, the man certainly saw the necessity. For all intents and purposes, Katsuki was an expert on explosives and explosive devices. The reptile was likely to have infinitely more luck at using their new acquisitions to escape than Aizawa. That is, if the human didn't mind them touching their stuff. Sure, I could, no problem. But do you think Nippy over there would let us screw around with his prizes? An excellent point. Aizawa would rather go the rest of his life keeping his never bitten by a human record spotless. Lord knows what kinds of horrors get put in that mouth. I'm sure if we ask nicely they would let us. Eri peeped helpfully. Her red eyes darted over to the human as she spoke. In the same moment a rough scraping sound rose from the human's corner. The human's muscled shoulders bunching as they did whatever it was they were doing. Aizawa set a doubtful gaze at the scarred back. I would love to work together with them Eri, but they don't speak basic. We need to be mindful of that. Which means no more running up to the human unexpectedly. His tone was gentle if a little scolding. The little girl bunched up her shoulders looking away sheepishly. We aren't gonna get anywhere being a bunch of spineless Viimpa worms. Katsuki huffed and hefted himself to his taloned feet. Just grab them and if they act up we put them in their place. Not waiting for an answer, the Trinitrox stomped forward. There was no effort to be quiet as he prowled over to the discarded weapons. With such an aggressive approach, it was no surprise that the human turned to see what was making such a ruckus behind them. Turning their head to the side, the human eyed Katsuki. Green eyes watched critically as the teen scooped up the two weapons. Red orbs focused on the human's form in return. Despite his bravado, Katsuki was smart. Careful attention was being paid to the human while he tested out the waters, the reptilian sentient watching for the slightest tensing of muscles. The human didn't stop him though, only observed before returning to its own task. See, the teen brayed smugly, the little human didn't even try to stop me. They know who the boss is. Doubtful that was exactly what just occurred, but it was relieving to have the stun sticks nonetheless. Get to work then, kid. I'll keep an ear out for the guards. They are bound to come back looking for those eventually. Last thing we need is for them to catch us crafting our escape, Aizawa ordered. Hissing indignantly, the blonde did just that, dismantling each component of the batons with care. Stripping wires, sorting electronics, connecting pieces. Each step was done with precision. Surprisingly, they were allowed to work uninterrupted. Even the human, who had finished partway through Katsuki's dismantling, watched on quietly. Their thin jacket draped lazily across their shoulders as they observed. Every once in a while they would make sounds to themselves, but ultimately they did not protest the dismantling of their strong-earned weapons. If it weren't for the strange tension of being held captive and being in a race against time for their freedom, the air in the cell would have held something akin to peace. For entirely different species coexisting in a small shared space. Even the ever-raging Katsuki's scowl had smoothed, leaving behind a soft yet thoughtful look. He was also once again indulging in his teacher's warmth, accepting the necessity of the action. They continued like this for much of the rest of the day, attentive to the sounds outside of their cell, but assured that those in the cell with them were not an immediate threat to their safety. When the food cart rolled around, Katsuki worked with Aizawa to tuck his work behind them and out of sight. The sentient who was tasked with delivering the gruel, another four-armed being, was very clearly terrified. It worked to the prisoner's benefit. The brute didn't linger longer than what was absolutely necessary, rushing onto the rest of their route. The whole time they were sending the human nervous glances, never quite making eye contact. In the guard's defense, the human had watched them the entire time. They had scarcely blinked, as if the human was anticipating a chase or fight. Neither of those happened though. The guards simply scurried away as quickly as they could. Their haste helped Katsuki's little project remain unnoticed. In the guards' wake were more bottles of fluids and more trays of slop. Just enough to keep them barely fed. When the human didn't rise to collect anything, Aizawa made the first move. Walking calmly forward on quiet paws to retrieve their share and leaving the humans untouched. Aizawa was unsure how much humans needed to drink, but he figured they couldn't last long without sustenance. Delivering the fluids to the other two in the cell, he turned his gaze back to the human. They were rather unobtrusive, tucked away in that little corner. Much like before their attention was locked to the prison door. Their digits were drumming quietly against the floor, mouth murmuring. Aizawa wasn't sure why, but this human didn't really seem to stop talking. A constant babble filled the air around them. A running narration for an audience that didn't exist, or at the very least couldn't understand them. Why isn't the human getting theirs? Eri whispered. Well, a whisper by a child's standards, which to anyone else was more like quieter, breathier talking. Obviously, the human doesn't want to touch this dupu they've been serving us. I wouldn't blame them for mistaking it for something you find in a toilet. I can't even properly identify what it is. Katsuki snarked, flicking his tongue over his maw with distaste as he poked at the food. But you said it's important to eat, the little girl pushed, reaching out to tug on his flight suit with her pearlescent fingers. Aizawa, you said we had to eat to try and stay healthy so we can get out? The feline rumbled thoughtfully. The human was oblivious to their discussion, still laser-focused on the cell door. If they want to starve themselves, let them. Katsuki sassed, shoveling a gloppy bite into his mouth. He very pointedly ignored Eri's angry pout. Well, they had to start somewhere. At least that's what Aizawa thought as he inched closer to the human's eye line. Hey, he barked, though not aggressively. The human twitched slightly, blinking rapidly as they pivoted their head towards Aizawa. Once again their head tilted. Despite Aizawa's lack of experience with the human gesture, he could still read it for what it was. Curiosity. It struck Aizawa once again just how large the human's green eyes were. Large and round, ever alert of everything in front of them. It was almost cute, if you could forget that not long ago those eyes had been narrowed into feral slits as the human used their teeth to tear into another sentient's hand. Making sure his gestures were slow and large, Aizawa gestured to the food and fluid bottle. You need to eat, he stated sternly. It was clear to see as the human followed the tip of Aizawa's claw to the tray of food. When they found what he was directing them to, their nose wrinkled. They did not move. Black ears pressed against his head in irritation as Aizawa barked, I'm serious, you need to take care of yourself. Once again he pointed to the food and fluids. The human, face still full of distaste, rose to their feet and scampered past Aizawa. The shoes they wore on their feet tapping against the grated floors. When they reached the door they stooped down and picked up the fluid bottle and clutched it to their Cittsah. The human lingered for a moment, picking up the tray carefully, eyeing over the food critically. Their pink nose twitched as they scented the air, then recoiled as they held the goop away from them. Doubtful was the best way to describe the human's new expression. They stared at Aizawa very clearly, and silently asking, "You expect me to eat this?" Bending over, the human moved to put it back down, but the adult stopped them once more. "Hey," he scolded, waiting for the human to look at him again. "No." While unclear with previous attempts, it was very obvious that the eye contact the human initiated this time was a battle for Demps. The little savage had the audacity to stare into his eyes as they went to put it back. "No," Aizawa warned. "No." The human snarked back, bottom lip jutting out in frustration. It was an expression scarily similar to Aries' pouts. The fool tried to put the tray down again. Emboldened by the human's unaggressive, if stubborn, behavior, Aizawa raised his voice. "No." The word accompanied by an irritated hiss. One that they heard Katsuki unconsciously mirror behind them, triggered by the familiar aggressive sound. This time the human jumped with surprise. Standing up straight, they glared down at the food, then back up to Aizawa. They were rewarded for their compliance with a loud yet baritone purr. In Aizawa's experience working with youths, rewarding behavior often yielded much better results than punishing it. Evidently it was a slide of genius, since the human immediately perked up at the sound. They gawked at Aizawa for a moment before their lips curled up into what they had eventually determined to be a happy expression human. Though this time their teeth were concealed, they bound over to Aizawa. Unable to help his cautious nature, the man tensed up in preparation of an attack and his purr petered out. Katsuki hissed a quiet warning at the human in response. The human didn't attack though. Lips pulling even wider, they got in close to Aizawa. He could feel their warm breath rustle his fur. What followed almost made the partis recoil in shock. Behind him, Eri and Katsuki perked up with interest. A vibrating sound akin to a purr escaped the human's mouth. It was not 100% accurate, but it was a surprisingly good imitation. It confused Aizawa. Based on the noises the human made for their language, he wouldn't have thought them capable of making the sound. Upon closer inspection, he made an interesting discovery. The human wasn't making the sound internally like he did. Instead, the human was manipulating the air somewhere in its mouth and upper throat. He even caught the human's tongue flickering as they pushed air out of their mouth. Black ears flicked back forward curiously, and he purred gently back at the human. They seemed to tremble slightly with excitement. With the human's attention locked firmly onto him, he mimed taking a bite out of the food. When the human's expression fell with displeasure, he purred again in encouragement. Reluctantly, the human took a minuscule taste from the tray. They glared at him petulantly for a few moments, clearly displeased with his self-satisfied expression. Huffing, they took another much more aggressive bite. Their glare was still in place, but it looked incredibly pained. You didn't have to be a genius to see that the human was not fond of the taste. Seeing as the human was so delighted the first time, Aizawa made another happy sound. This time he chuffed at the human. Once again the human lit up, listening closely to the sound. All of them watched in wonder as the human made a round, sort of puckered shape with their lips. They seemed to taste the sound, playing with their mouth shape and throat as they tested a few huffing sounds before once again managing to imitate Aizawa. Again not exact, but still impressive. After getting the human engaged with mimicking them, it was surprisingly easy to coax them to eat. At some point even Katsuki had been convinced to participate by Eri. Both of them had been rather surprised when they almost effortlessly copied the Trinitrox's breathy hiss. The humans seemed to find it all incredibly amusing. The small sense of ease they established was interrupted not long after when a group of guards appeared outside the cell. The human had been in the middle of working out a particularly tricky yet guttural sound of Katsuki's when they and Aizawa seemed to freeze almost simultaneously. Aizawa's black ears stood at attention while the humans swiveled their head to stare at the cell door. 5 guards approached the cell this time. Though the 5th, who lagged nervously behind the rest of the group, looked suspiciously similar to the guard that had been sent fleeing from their cell in terror. The guard appeared to be curling in on themselves. Under no circumstances would they look directly at the human either. Instead, their gaze skirted submissively around them. The very same human who was now openly snarling at the door. "That is what you are afraid of?" Seriously, the apparent leader of the group jeered. She was somewhat larger than the rest of the brutes around them. A long, jagged scar sliced from one side of her face to the next. "That human is so small and squishy, I'm surprised it didn't break itself hitting you." Aizawa cautiously flicked his eyes to the human, lingering on the red split flesh on the human's knuckles. Technically, the human did break themselves a little to retaliate. Problem is, the human didn't seem to care about that. The nervous brute shushed their companion quickly. "Hush. Don't agitate it. After it nearly killed us, I did some digging and I don't think we should rile the human up. Do you know what that human did to the team that collected it? If this thing is supposed to be so tough, then why do they look fine?" the leader asked, rather condescendingly. A small hand from their secondary arms waved in the direction of the other 3 sentients in the cell. One of the data links I found said humans are social CR creatures. I think the human I imprinted on them and adopted them as some kind of pack. When we tried to remove the pulvis, we threatened the human's P-pack and it attacked, was the nervous answer. Mocking laughter immediately followed. "I don't care if the human is protective of them. We need that pulvis. Overhaul is on his way to our location, and when he gets here he wants that pulvis. We need to get it out and prepped for the pickup in a few cycles. The boss isn't going to accept that this wimpy little flesh bag stopped us from doing our job," the leader growled. She stomped forward, staring directly into the human's eyes. A large hand slammed against the bars. Instead of startling the human, this only seemed to rile them up more. Prompting the human to take a lurching step forward as well, shoulders pushing back and hands clenched tightly. "Let me show you how to put a new asset in its place," the leader rumbled. "If you other 3 know what's good for you, stay in that corner. Make a move and I will have my crew punish you accordingly." The leader tossed in Aizawa's direction, eyes lingering threateningly on the children behind him. The call garnered a breathy hiss from Katsuki. "And no, W." The nervous brute tried to stop their leader, only to go ignored. The cell door creaked open as the brute leader lumbered in. Reaching toward her waistband, she pulled out a small cylinder. With a flick of her wrist, it came to life, unspooling a WHP that buzzed with electricity. With a test snap, the guard closed in slightly on the human. "You may not understand my language, but you will certainly understand who the boss is around here, flesh bag," the leader rumbled. Moments after the declaration, the human received the first lash. The WHP arced across the human's bare shoulder. A yelp escaped their lips as they jerked back. Their head tidled away and arm came up to shield their face from the weapon. Aizawa tensed up with rage at the act, limbs begging to launch forward and intervene, but he couldn't without risking Eri and Katsuki. The children were more important. The human took a small step back but impressively remained on their feet. Their assailant watched on smugly. A heavy tension fell over the cell as everyone waited to see how the human would react. The only sounds were the muffled cries of Eri and the nervous wheezes of one of the guards outside the cell. Slowly the human lowered their arm. The face that was revealed was not that of a hesitant or subdued prisoner. It was that of a raging storm. Dark and violent, with little mercy to spare. The human stepped forward. Another lash, though this time the human managed to partially sidestep, muscles locking up briefly with the shock. The human shook out their spasming arm, never breaking eye contact. 2 gashes were now seeping crimson on the human's body. Their lips parted and they growled something out at the brute. Even without a direct translation, it was clear it was nothing nice, and probably not suitable for young ears. In a moment of startling clarity, Aizawa realized why the human had so vehemently refused most of the food they were served. The food bore the same overwhelming metallic scent of the BLD that was now seeping from the human's wounds. "What's the matter, giving up now?" the brute laughed. "I thought you were supposed to be tough." The statement was punctuated with a wild crack of the WHP. A swing that got a little close to Aizawa and his charges for comfort. Eri whimpered when the WHP sliced through the air in front of the corner they huddled into. That got the human's attention. Green eyes shot over to the three of them, widening slightly before bunching up with rage once more. This time the human took a massive step forward, barking something at the sentient with the WHP. "Oh, didn't like that, did you?" was the response. Snarling, the brute made another violent, much closer, lash at the group in the corner. "How do you like that? I'm going to be taking the pulvis away once I've taught you a lesson, and you aren't even going to fight me." Aizu. Eri whimpered in fright as Katsuki pushed her further behind them. As if a sniveling inferior creature like you could even hope to take her away. Katsuki snarled. The leader's thick head jerked sideways, eyes blazing. "What did you say, you dash?" Funny thing about humans, it seems they have little concern for playing fair. The moment the brute averted her gaze, the human charged forward. Their sweater flapped from their rapid movements as they leapt up, fist soaring through the air in an uppercut. With a crack, the brute's head lolled backwards. A cry of alarm slipped out of her as she took a heavy step back. Snarling, the human moved for the hand holding the WHP. Unluckily for the human, the brute had put more force into her arm as her clenched hand swung down, striking the human across the face and knocking them back a few feet. Metal clanged as the human tumbled back. They hadn't even come to a complete stop and they were already trying to climb back to their feet. "Arg," the brute howled, yellow blood-tainted spittle flying from her mouth. "You cracking vermin waste." WHP raised high, the brute brought it down as strong as she could. The sparking WHP tearing through the sweater and searing a line across the human's back. It halted the human's progress for a few moments, and just as they were recovering, another lash was painted across their back. This time the human grunted in pain. The weapon was raised once more, but this time when the WHP whistled through the air towards them, one of the human's arms shot up. The black weapon coiled around their wrist. The muscles underneath the electrified material jumped and twitched with the shock. Surprise washed across the brute's face as the human's jerking hand wound around the WHP. The sound of the skin sizzling slightly was appalling, and the scent of burning flesh was enough to turn stomachs. The guard allowed the WHP to stay active for a few moments. The human left on their knees, muscles spasming. When the WHP finally stopped, the human slumped forward, their chest heaved with gasping breaths. Their hands still wrapped up in the WHP dangled limply from the taut weapon. With a sneer, the brute turned to her underlings. "See? Everything has a breaking point. Even your so-called terrifying humans have a limit." Her tone was packed with haughty superiority. The other crew members seemed relieved for a moment, before their eyes bugged out in horror. "What are you, dash?" The brute started only for the WHP to be jerked out of her hold. She whirled around just in time to watch the human pull a sharpened shard from their waistband and drive it deep into her wrist. Blood instantly spurted from the wound, spraying wildly as the brute howled with pain. Her grip went slack, dropping the WHP as she kicked the human, tearing the shiv violently from her flesh and making the wound even messier. The humans smacked into the wall with a grunt. Snarling, the humans slowly heaved themselves to their feet. The WHP was still wrapped around one hand, the other was streaming with yellow blood. Slowly the human brought their improvised knife up, pointing it directly at the guard who was now tightly clutching her wrist. With a dark expression and a barking yell, the human beckoned their opponent closer. Aizu slowly moved to cover Eri's eyes. The human's eyes were practically feral, their hand clenched so tightly over their weapon that small drops of red startled to drip from their hand. He didn't want the child to witness whatever horrific atrocity the human was about to commit. The scent of the guard's blood was heavy in the air. The smell had a sharp tang to it that made those with stronger senses wrinkle their nose with distaste. The soft plip-plip of the yellow liquid could be heard as every sentient in the vicinity seemed to pause, holding their breaths and dreading what would come next. The only one seemingly unbothered by the atmosphere was the one responsible for creating it. The human stood still, muscles bunched and at the ready, and eyes locked on tight to their opponent. They were waiting for her to make the next move. A cautious step back was taken as the brute re-evaluated what was meant to be her prey. She clearly hadn't expected the human to bite back. More often than not, pain and punishments seemed to subdue rebellious behavior in most sentient species. The human only seemed to become more aggressive, completely ignoring the sensible option of giving in and avoiding further injury. Aizawa had silently hoped that the guard would get the message that the human was not to be trifled with and leave well enough alone. It was obvious to all present that nothing she did was going to tame them. All that she would accomplish is ticking it off further. None of them wanted to know what a human in a true rage would do. However, instead of doing the smart thing and retreating to regroup, the guard allowed her pride to lead her. With a snarl, she moved to regain the ground she had just given to the human, seemingly dismissing them as a threat once more, likely assuming the human's last successful attack to be some sort of fluke. Releasing her bleeding wrist, she glared directly into the human's toxic green eyes. Seeing that the fool was evidently incapable of setting aside her ego, Aizawa silently ushered his charges closer to the wall. They didn't get far as they were already practically hunched up against the corner. But any distance they could gain was worth it. Leaning in, Katsuki whispered in Aizawa's twitching ear, "Shouldn't we dash? No. We need to wait for the proper time to intervene. Getting involved without first analyzing the situation is unwise," Aizawa scolded in a hushed voice, though his eyes flicked over to the other 4 guards outside the door. He didn't think they needed to worry about the guard from last time. They were still thoroughly terrified of the human. The other 3 may still pose a problem. Aizawa's thoughts were interrupted by the human saying something to the guard. Their tone was low, lower than when they had babbled at Aizawa and his wards earlier. It was almost breathy with a hint of a rasp and not friendly in the slightest. "What a fool," the leader huffed, "no one speaks your pathetic language here." She turned her head slightly, but not enough to remove the human from her somewhat narrow line of sight. "I want 3 of you in here. I'm sick of wasting time on this human." The 4 outside the cell instantly turned to look at each other, waiting for one of them to volunteer. The guard who experienced the human's wrath the first time around immediately backed up further. "I'm not going near that thing again. You can demote me and put me on cleaning duty all you want," they declared. The others grumbled at them, but didn't try to argue. They still didn't think such a small creature was worth all this trouble. Sure, the thing got a few lucky hits here and there, but it was still a fragile creature at the end of the day. Even a youngling could leave a mark on occasion. With a few snippy complaints, one of them popped the door open and shuffled in. 2 more followed after. All of them kept a hand hovered over their stun sticks. "You better keep an eye on the other 3, one of them grumped to the nervous guard outside the door. They moved forward, flanking their superior and glaring down at the human. The cell was rather cramped now, the hulking forms of the guards filling up the small space. Only a few tail lengths of space sat between Aizawa and the grouped-up guards. The human had even less space. The grunts themselves were practically brushing elbows as they clustered together and loomed over them. With a smug sneer, the leader pointed to her W and commanded, "Now give that back and I might make your punishment easier." The human didn't respond. "Give it," she demanded again. This time she shook an open and waiting hand. With a curled lip, the human looked her dead in the eye. "No," they bellowed. Then, to wrap their defiance in a nice bow, proceeded to spit directly in her face. What is it with humans and spitting? Aizawa ummed internally. Of course, he just so happened to teach the human to say the one word they could use to rile up their captors too. The Pardus wanted desperately to smack his face against the wall just so he could knock himself unconscious and avoid this whole mess. The snapping of the guard's patience was practically audible. Her open hand twitched violently as she tried to restrain herself from curling it into a claw. "You are very fortunate I'm not allowed to kill you," she hissed. Her voice was warbling with rage. One of her small hands raised up to wipe the thick globs from her face. Her other hand gestured her underlings forward. "Teach it a lesson," she commanded imperiously. A sick sort of pleasure was swirling in her eyes. The 3 grunts lumbered forward, reaching towards their belts. Aizawa's hackles raised. He wanted nothing more than to intervene in that moment. Dark eyes glanced mournfully behind him. Unfortunately for the human, Aizawa had younglings to worry about. The younglings had to take priority. The human didn't wait for the encroaching sentients to converge on them. With no warning they charged, the hand holding the WHP flicked to adjust their grip. Ducking down, the human darted between the guard on the far left's legs. Their victim tried to clumsily grab the human as they sped by, but missed entirely. As they slipped through, they lashed out with the WHP, wrapping it around the guard's ankle. Bursting out the other side, the human juked to the left, sliding through the opening between the second guard's legs. All the brutes were panicking and bumped into each other in their rush to get their eyes back on the human. This allowed the human to slink around them with ease. With a vicious curling of their lips, the human pulled the WP taut, fingers pressing violently on the WSSW. Electricity crackled to life along the length of the weapon. The bolts arced through the two brutes the human had ensnared. Their bodies jolted violently as they screamed in pain. With a roar, the human threw their weight forward, swiping the two grunts' feet out from under them. They went down strong, skulls cracking against the ground with a sickening sharpness. The sound elicited a whimper from Eri and even had Katsuki shuddering. Minutely, small yellow puddles slowly crept out from the two down sentients' heads. Their forms lay crumpled on the floor. Aizawa didn't know if they were dead, but they were certainly not getting back up anytime soon. "What the dash?" the leader bellowed. She didn't have time to finish as the human barreled towards her. They no longer held the WHP in their grip, but they still had their improvised knife brandished and ready to taste BLD. Out of fear, the leader kicked clumsily at the human. Despite its sloppy nature, the hit landed, the blow glancing across the human's torso and sending them skidding across the floor. A choked HRA slipped out of the human's mouth as they hit the ground. Bright green eyes opened in pained slits. Aizawa could already see the human reorienting their plan of attack in their head as they staggered back to their feet. Pain and anger seemed to meld into some seamless amalgamation on their face. The human flicked their gaze over to the downed guards, ensuring they were out for the count, then shot over to Aizawa and his bunch. For the brief moment the human's eyes landed on them, the cruelty melted away and something Aizawa would almost describe as kind took over. That moment was gone just as quick as it came, since the snarl quickly took over the human's face once more as they darted their attention back to the opponents before them. "No," the human rasped, visibly working themselves up. It was clear there were so many things the human wanted to say in that moment, but they only knew one word. A word that became a vessel of such visceral feeling. It resonated deep in Aizawa and Katsuki's bones. Defiance and rage and perseverance in their rawest form. And oh, the human barked louder this time, swaying to the side as they started to circle the huddling guards. Slowly but surely the human was herding them into a corner. The other guards sat frozen outside the cell, eyes wide in fear and their back pressed firmly to the wall. "Watch it closely," the boss demanded. "It's slippery." The tides were turning. Aizawa could see it. If their captors were smart, they would realize that they may not be the victors of this fight. The black-furred sentient hoped they were stupid and stumbled into their demise. The human was already angry. They might as well get something out of it now. Tucking his chin close to his, the man murmured to his cadet, "Katsuki, is your little surprise done?" His attention was fixated on the cowering guard outside their cell. Red eyes slid over to him as the student whispered haughtily back, "Who do you think you're talking to? Be ready to use it," the Pardus ordered, eyes very obviously cutting to the cell door. Nodding tightly, the reptilian hunched slightly, talking softly into Eri's ears. Aizawa focused back on the human's fight just in time to see the last grunt in the cell step in front of their leader and take a swipe at the human with their baton. While her subordinate did the work, she hung back, scrutinizing the human's movement. The guard's swing at the human was futile as they simply danced backwards. Emboldened by the human's retreat, the brute swung again. This continued for 2 more strikes before Aizawa finally caught on to what the human was doing. With each swipe and dodge, the human was luring the guard further away from their leader. The leader, who seemed content letting her crewmate be the sacrificial bait that wore the human out so she could swoop in and attack the human unawares. At least that's what Aizawa assumed her plan was. She appeared ready to jump into the fight at a moment's notice. Once the human was satisfied with the distance it had gotten from the other guard, they launched their assault. Feigning another backwards dodge, they ducked the next swipe. After the weapon whistled past, the human surged forward. Jumping up, they scaled up the guard's side. In a rather impressive maneuver, they swung their body up and around their victim's arm. Muscled legs wrapped themselves around the sentient's neck, The move pinned one of the creature's shoulders and arms uncomfortably against their face. The human curled up, sliding the knife easily between the gaps in the guard's natural plating on their shoulder as a handhold. Then all at once the human constricted, muscles rippling as they tightened like a vice. The guard, who was letting out pained and panicked shrieks, tried desperately to pry off the human. They were largely unsuccessful, with one arm pinned, the other unable to find a good hold, and the last too weak to make a difference. The whole while the human kept tossing glances towards the boss, who was trying to slowly lurk closer. When she thought the human wasn't paying attention, she tried to rush them. Her surprise attack was cut to a screeching halt when the humans snatched something from their waistband. It was another food tray knife, one that was sent whistling towards her. Yelping, she dove out of the way, the knife clattering noisily against the wall behind her. It had been a near miss on the human's part, the knife sailing close enough to the brute's face that she had to have felt it going by. With a cry of frustration, she settled back into glaring at the human, internally debating if they had more weapons hidden anywhere on their body. Not once throughout the whole ordeal did the human's grip on the guard's throat falter. At first glance, the hold appeared to be an ineffectual attempt at suffocation. After a few moments, it became clear that suffocation was not the human's goal. The guard got only a couple desperate swipes at the human, giving up on trying to tear them off, before their struggles started to slow. Their eyes started to bulge and flutter as they swayed on their feet. In what felt like moments, the behemoth tilted forward and came crashing down. Eyes rolled back and mouth gaping. The human leapt off as the behemoth fell. Their knife slipped out of the guard's flesh with a schlick, thick yellow droplets arcing through the air with the swing of the knife. For good measure, the human reeled their foot back and kicked the guard across the face with a heavy whump. Breathing, the humans stepped over their fallen opponents, their free hand raised. Then, as if to taunt the brute, they slowly curled their fingers a few times. The gesture practically screamed, "Come at me!" The two were locked onto each other, gazes clashing and grinding like the mighty plates that formed the crust of the human's home planet. "See, Commander!" The grunt outside the cell yelped in alarm. "Silence!" The leader howled at them, eyes never once leaving the human that dared challenge her. She started walking forward, ready to meet the human face-on. After careful observation, she was confident she was prepared for the human. "See, Cittsah." Perhaps she was ready for the human this time. Unfortunately, she forgot this cell had more than just a human in it. A black shape blurred behind her, clawed hand raised high and wielding the human's discarded knife. With a hiss, Aizawa plunged the knife into the back of Cittsah's neck, blood spurting. "Katsuki!" roared the man as he yanked the knife out and plunged it back into the writhing form beneath him. He felt the rough edges of the knife's handle tear at his palm as yellow fluid spurted from the wound. The Partis's stomach was clenching uncomfortably from the violent scene. He hated killing, but unfortunately he wasn't left with much of a choice. The cadet didn't need any more prompting. After tucking Eri into the corner, he sprinted to the cell door and began setting up a series of small devices on its hinges. As his hands swiftly danced through the motions, he gave the grunt outside the cell a withering glare, causing them to freeze with their hand on their communicator. "If you so much as twitch, I'm setting that human on you. I wonder what it will do to you if it gets a second shot," the reptilian threatened. Gulping, the grunt slowly raised all four of their trembling hands, their knees caving as they slid down the wall and roughly hit the ground. "Good," Katsuki purred mockingly. Work done. The teen slapped one more device to the door's lock, then rushed away from the explosives. "We're live," he declared as he slid over to cover Eri. A series of sharp pops filled the air with small puffs of smoke as the miniature bombs detonated. They were powerful yet controlled, only spitting out small bits of shrapnel. Katsuki never failed to impress with his prowess in explosives and pyrotechnics. With a groan, the cell door started to slide loose, toppling to the ground with an ear-ringing clatter. It hadn't even settled before Aizawa was out the door and crowding the remaining guard. In the man's hand was a stun stick he lifted from one of the downed crewmates in the cell. Without a word, he jabbed it into their neck, flipped the settings to high, and clamped down on the trigger. The electricity knocked their seizing body out in seconds. "There, now the human won't bother you," Aizawa stated. Turning, he ordered, "We need to get moving." I don't know if anyone heard that, but I'm not waiting to find out. Katsuki gripped Eri's shoulders and pushed her towards the partis as he quickly ran over to the down bodies and lifted a communicator and stun baton. When he looked over, he found the human collecting the WHP from the brutes they tripped up and rifling through their pockets. They inexplicably seemed to feel his gaze and lifted their head up. Green met red and their face bunched up again, teeth bared in that allegedly happy way. Their head was tilted much like a curious youngling. This contrasted heavily with the evidence of their violent acts that lay strewn about on the ground below them. They looked, at least in comparison to earlier, everything about them appeared pinched and uncomfortable. The dark marks underneath their eyes were even more pronounced and their skin was noticeably paler. It was probably still livid. It wasn't unheard of for Katsuki's species to shift the colors of their scales when agitated. Katsuki's own scales tended to blacken when enraged, particularly around his throat. He concluded that humans must be the same. Human. Katsuki. Eri called with a trembling voice from the doorway. This way. The little girl was terrified, but she was putting on a brave face. Being separated from the whole group clearly put her on edge, and she obviously wanted nothing more than to just leave this place. The human babbled inquisitively back at her, body popping around the door frame. The WHP was looped loosely around their shoulder, handle dangling near their cisti. Their knife was missing, likely tucked away out of sight. The sweaters, which had previously been left hanging open, was zipped up and the sleeves rolled up to the human's elbows. The green-haired sentient paused to eye the blown-open door before turning to shoot trinitrox in the cell, an odd gesture. Their fist clenched with only their thumb pointing upwards. Whatever the move meant, it was twisted by the yellow BLD staining their hands. With a confused growl, the cadet pushed past the human and out to his teacher. "Which way are we going?" he asked. Glancing back and forth, Aizawa made a quick decision and pivoted confidently in one direction. Guards don't come back when they walk by on rotations, which probably means that either way we go it somehow connects back to a main corridor. The food cart is usually full when they walk by to feed us too, which means we are one of the first stops. So, if we go this way, it's probably our shortest route out of this cell. Eri shuffled over to them. But what about the others? We aren't the only ones they took, right? Sighing, Aizawa crouched down. If we let them out now, they might get hurt trying to escape. Our best option is getting out and releasing a distress signal. Our backup can help save the sentients still locked up in the ship. The answer wasn't enough to satisfy the little one. She seemed to wilt more, looking forlornly behind them. She was distracted when the human ducked back into the cell for a few moments before returning to the hall. They chirped at the deflated youngling, confused. Then she turned her sad eyes and met the human, as if expecting them to work another miracle. Aizawa had to suppress a wince when the human discreetly wiped the BLD off their hands with some wetted fabric he assumes they returned to the cell to retrieve. It looked like the shirt they had discarded after their first fight. The human, ever attentive, ambled over to Eri. All the while it was taking careful stock of their surroundings. They appeared ready for the next obstacle to come creeping up on them. When they reached her, they crouched down, rather close to Aizawa. Reaching out with a now clean hand, the human gently pet at Eri's head, smoothing out her trichome-like hair and delicately loosening tangles, the whole while cooing to the dejected little girl. It took a moment, but her mournful expression melted slightly, eyes slipping closed, a very trusting move that set Aizawa's teeth on edge and huffing. Aizawa wasn't sure how he felt about these growing attachments with such a volatile creature. He was at least soothed that the humans seemed to be treating them like a pack that needed to be protected, and not an enemy that needed to be eliminated. Gently, the humans slipped their hand into Eri's and slowly stood. Before the human could try to wander off, Aizawa called to it as he half-shuffled the way he wanted them to go. "Hey, this way," he said. Eri assisted him in his efforts. She started pulling on the human's hand to try and lead it in Aizawa's direction. The human took a few steps to follow, but seemed to stop short when they heard the clicking squeak noise their shoes made on the metal sheet floors. Lips pulled down as the human released Eri's hand for a moment and plopped onto their rear in the middle of the hallway. At first, Aizawa feared they were going to refuse to proceed for some reason incomprehensible to them. That thought was silenced as he watched the humans slide off their shoes and the fabric covering their feet. Tying the laces together, the humans slung the shoes over their shoulder. Then they stood up, taking Aries' hand back into their much larger scarred one. Now when they moved, they were practically silent, bare feet whispering across the metal surface. Great, so now they were capable of being stealthy too. They followed with no argument after that, and Katsuki took up the rear, muzzle pulled up in a concentrated scowl. The hulls were silent. Considering that the ship had to have more prisoners and guards, it was unsettling. Even the largest of ships typically had some faint sign of other life being present. Aizawa's own ship was often filled with distant sounds of voices. The faint tapping of feet. The hiss of air circulation systems. For it to be this silent, they had to be running the ship with a skeleton crew. It was fortunate for them, but also unsettling. Where had the rest of the crew gone? Why had they left? They all slunk quietly along the hull, passing all kinds of cell doors, all of which had been empty so far. The lack of life emboldened Eri since she spoke up after too long. Aizawa, she whispered, do you think the human has a name? That I suppose they probably do. At least that's what he remembered hearing. So far, the Rosephilus remained the only known sentient species who identified its members through ranks and numbers. They were a nasty bunch. Territorial and loyal to a fault to their queens, but they could be useful allies. If only because of their sheer numbers. Humans, like most sentients, tended to have individual names to help separate themselves. Although Aizawa had also heard that some humans had several names. Not necessarily an uncommon practice, but the sheer number some of them had was honestly ridiculous. Aizawa heard about a human that had been witnessed answering to no less than 6 names. Only one of them was a B'arch given name. How in the vast galaxies could they keep track of it all? Eri sat in a brief pensive silence, staring up at the human who was still cradling her hand gently. Their head was still observantly swiveling back and forth. Shyly she tugged at their joined hands. Human, she said softly. That was all it took for the human to give her a large portion of its attention. It hunched down slightly, as if trying to get closer to her level to speak to her. What's your? Oh, wait. Her little brow furrowed as she stared at the human determinately. After some consideration, she pointed at herself and said, Eri. Her slide of genius was met with a blank stare. They babbled apologetically, hunching their head down into their shoulders. Like a youngling caught digging around where they aren't supposed to. The little one deflated slightly, pointing at herself again and saying with considerably less confidence, Eri. Then she turned and pointed to the other 2 in the group, Aizawa. Katsuki. The human's lips turned down briefly, slowly mouthing the names she said but not quite understanding their significance. That is until something seemed to hit them. Understanding sparked life inside the human's eyes. Excitedly they gestured to Eri, and to the girl's delight repeated her name back to her. The girl's ecstatic bouncing only served to spur the human on. They turned to Aizawa and within 2 tries was able to properly pronounce the man's name. Finally, the human settled Katsuki and attempted to say the cadet's name. The important word here is attempt because for whatever reason this human could not get Katsuki's name right. If it weren't for their rather treacherous situation, Aizawa would have chuckled at the poor attempts. Katsuki? No, Katsuki Eri gently corrected. Kazuki? They tried again, cheeks tinting a curious shade of pink that contrasted sharply with the human's paling cheeks. Another gentle correction. At this point even Katsuki got involved. Whisper shouting at the human every time they got it wrong. Thankfully, the human took in stride and didn't seem to mind the berating, only making a barking, chortling sound as they continued their attempts. After one whispered, but particularly screechy, hiss of, "Oh you imbecile. Katsuki." The human gave up, stared directly at the reptile sentient and declared, Kaken. Not a hint of fear or hesitation to be found. Aizawa was honestly impressed that they hadn't given up earlier. He was also amused when Kaken began pulling at his horns, suppressing a roar of rage with a painful wheeze. Even Eri seemed amused by the display, swing the human's hand and trying to mimic their happy expression back at them. After that declaration, the human pointed to themselves and said, Midoriya Izuku. Eri lit up, her small branching horn literally glowing with delight. The sight lifted up Aizawa's and Katsuki's spirits somewhat. Pulvis were known to be bioluminescent, however only a healthy Pulvis who felt comfortable was capable of it. Bioluminescence was a crucial part of their nonverbal communication as a species. Eri being able to summon up a glow, feeble as it was, bode well for the little one's well-being. Izuku. Eri murmured reverently, having latched onto the last, easier-to-pronounce name and continued to repeat it. The name a steady loop on her tongue as she accustomed herself to the feel of the word. Looking up at the sentients surrounding her, Eri tried to output a brighter glow. She wanted them to see her gratitude as she whispered, Thank you for saving me, Aizawa, Katsuki, Izuku. You don't need to thank us, little one, Aizawa responded. Back turned to them as he led them through the winding halls. Silence fell over the group as they wandered. The ship itself was old and raggedy, but for whatever reason it was excessively clean. Aizawa was almost certain they had scrubbed the whole ship as thoroughly as a medical room. The smell of disinfectants and other cleaners still lingered in the air. He had a feeling he knew exactly why it was like this. Overhaul was notorious for many obvious reasons, but one well-known fact about him was his desperation for cleanliness. The man was a purist in the most literal sense, finding most other sentient species absolutely abhorrent. He was also a staunch hater of half-breeds. Despite this being an overhaul ship, the sentient had not been present during their capture. It was likely just a grunt ship in his fleet that was used to transport goods. One he only visited from time to time when he needed something. This was confirmed by what he had heard earlier. The guards mentioned overhaul wanting something with Eri. They likely have been getting things ready for the man's arrival. If Aizawa's speed picked up slightly after drawing those conclusions, he couldn't be blamed. It was only after wandering for a long while they came across their first obstacle. Rather, their first obstacle stumbled across them. They had just slunk around the corner when Aizawa heard the distant steps of another sentient down one of the other halls. Black ears flicked back with irritation and his tail swished. The Pardus moved to backtrack and ambush the sentient as they went by, only to watch in horror as Izuku, who must have heard the sound as well, dropped Eri's hand and took off down the hall. Their WHP was drawn and their shoes sat in Eri's confused hands. It had all happened too fast for her to work out how she ended up with a handful of shoe and not human. It was also too sudden for Katsuki to intervene. His much less delicate hearing hadn't caught onto the approaching figure, so he was not prepared for the human's sudden dash towards him. What the crek? The Trinitrox hissed quietly as the human shoved past him. Aizawa couldn't even bark at his cadet to stop the human before they disappeared around the corner. "WH, howdy," echoed around the corner moments after Izuku disappeared from sight. All three shared a glance before rushing over to the corner, Eri tucked protectively between the feline and reptilian. Craning their heads around the corner, they were met with the sight of the human choking out a guard with their W. The poor fool's eyes were bulging, 4 elbows working frantically to try and hit the human. Only his smaller, much weaker arms managed to bounce harmlessly off Izuku though. A dull silence settled over them. At this point they were almost used to watching the human carry out such violent acts. "That thing is a cracking BLD thirsty psychopath," Katsuki declared before a viciously pleased scowl pulled at his maw. The large body, the human, was suffocating, slumped to the ground. They then watched as Izuku dragged the limp body over to what looked like a maintenance closet whose door had been left ajar and clumsily shoved guard in. They tore up some cloth to bind and GG him, and then the maniac took the time to rifle through his pockets, and of course Izuku managed to find a plasma knife there. As if Aizawa's life wasn't already a chaotic enough mess. Eri elbowed Katsuki weakly. "They aren't a thing. They are Izuku. But Deku is a cracking bloodthirsty psychopath." For a moment Aizawa thought Eri would protest the new nickname. He hadn't a clue as to what it meant, but knowing Katsuki it was likely less than kind. Instead the little one nodded, then turned to Aizawa. "Can we keep him?" A loud thud was heard as Izuku tried to slam the closet door shut, only for the guard's head to get in the way. The door bounced back open and with a wince the human looked over at them guiltily. Pressing his face firmly against the wall, Aizawa groaned. What had he done to deserve this? How was this his life? But they had met several other patrols as they wound their way through the ship. All of them met the same fate as the other guards that put themselves in the human's warpath. Thankfully, the human gave them time to intervene this time. Aizawa had an inkling that humans were capable of using pack tactics in combat. The fact that the human had helped him sneak up on the brute in the cell was a glowing example of that. It was only now that they really got to work alongside the human. Despite the Izuku's sometimes rather brutal tactics, they were an efficient partner. They were not, however, the best at minding their own personal safety, and it was obvious the human was beginning to lag. In the last skirmish, the human had gained a rather nasty blow to the head. Even now the cut on the wound was bleeding sluggishly. It was worrying, but there wasn't much Aizawa could do about it. Still, he resolved to try and handle things before the human tried to involve themselves. They were near the docking bays now. Aizawa knew this for a fact because he vividly remembered being dragged half-conscious through these halls before losing the fight to stay awake. The hallway branched off into two paths ahead of them, and Aizawa was positive that they would find the escape pods just a little further down the left part of the intersection. As they got closer, though, the sound of someone muttering angrily to themselves became obvious to Aizawa and the human. They all crouched down low, pressed up against the wall as the man peeked his black furred head around the corner. There was a sentient there using the maintenance station. It was different from the four armed ones guarding the ship. It was one he actually recognized, an Arikara. Arikara are a tall, lean species with slim torsos, long tentacle-like limbs, and large bulbous heads. Heads they filled with buoyant gases to help them float and move about. Their mouths consisted of strong beak-like structures and was one of the only tough things about them. Even their skulls were softer than their beak. They weren't a particularly strong species, but they were certainly slippery. That wasn't what caught Aizawa's attention, though. Wrapped up in their slimy tentacles was a datapad, a newer model at that too. That datapad could very well be their saving grace. Such a new model was not only good for maintaining a ship's systems, they also could be used to help boost, conceal, and send long-distance transmissions. With that, Aizawa could ensure their emergency message got exactly where it needed to be. There was also the added bonus of them being able to access a database that helped them translate and communicate with Izuku if it was recent enough. Slowly he pulled back, resting his eyes on Izuku. The human was hovering over Eri, glancing back behind them every few moments, before noticing Aizawa's attention on them. Hesitantly the human pointed at themselves and pointed around the corner, head tilted in confusion. Aizawa held up a hand, motioning for them to stay. He coiled up, weapon clenched in his hand. As much as he would love to just use the regular stun stick for its intended purpose, he couldn't. The electric charge could very well fry the datapad. He waited patiently till the Arikara turned its head to inspect the datapad. Then he pounced, rounding the corner and cracking the Arikara across the head with the butt of his baton. Not ideal, but it was better than using the shock function. The blunt edge sunk into layers of gas-filled soft tissue before cracking against the Arikara's skull and knocking them unconscious. Gas wheezed out of them as they deflated, no longer having the ability to hold it in. The limp, noodly form seemed to slip to the ground like a chunky liquid. Slimy soft tissue and muscle creating a rather lumpy puddle. Gritting his teeth, Aizawa swiftly got to digging around on the Arika, relieving them of the datapad, and swiping the keycards he hadn't initially seen hanging off the back of their belt. Then he waved his pack over and set to getting them quickly to the escape pods. By some miracle they had gone unnoticed so far. Part of him assumed it was because they had to have taken out at least half of the crew running the ship right now. Another, more paranoid part of him worried it was a trap. Regardless of the reason, Aizawa wasn't about to squander their chances. The escape pods were very clearly visible before them. Scrambling over to the large metal doors of the pods, Aizawa turned and commanded, "Keep watch," to Katsuki before setting to work. He didn't have to tell the teen twice, and the human seemed to catch on pretty well too. Leaning against the wall and staring down the hall, hand wiping at their bloody forehead. Eri's small hand was clenched once more in the human's other hand. Pulling out the key card, Aizawa first set to getting access to the pod, which was easy enough. His next task was much more difficult. He had to ensure that the ship did not alert the crew that an escape pod was being deployed. If the crew so much as suspected something was awry before they got some distance, they were screwed. As he worked, he noticed something unsettling. The ship seemed to be running on lower power, this section of the ship having most of its output cut down to the bare minimum. This meaning he had to actively bring the pod to life. The data helped significantly in this task, and after some grueling work, Aizawa managed to trick the system into ignoring any activity with this pod. That didn't stop the niggling voice in the back of his head. Why was the ship practically on a lockdown? Usually ships only cut down power to that degree when they were hiding from something. So what were they doing and why were they so short-handed? He didn't have the luxury of time to think about it. The pod door hissed open and he swiftly ushered everyone in. It was a sizable pod, meant to hold over double the amount of sentients here. 10 seats in total lined the pod's walls with a maintenance station inlaid on the seats on each side. The back walls were designated for storage for rations, medkits, etc. Aizawa quickly ran to the pilot's seat, hands blurring over the dashboard as he coaxed the ship to life. Katsuki, time to put your training to use. Connect the data pad to the maintenance station over there and send out an emergency transmission. Imada should be combing any and all signals trying to find us. Give him something to track us down with. Don't let overhaul's goons here. The Trinitrox grunted in agreement, slumping down into one of the side seats and syncing with the maintenance station. Eri followed the reptilian, sitting down by his feet and watching it all unfold with nervous eyes. Izuku seemed to wander to the opposite station, pulling something out of his pocket and doing something Aizawa couldn't be bothered to worry about right now. They needed to get out and they needed to do it now. The ship vibrated gently as it sputtered to life. Knocks and clicks filled the pod as it slowly detached from its docking station. Then with a whump it disengaged. Taking the pod's yoke firmly in his hand, he jerked it forwards, making the ship speed away. The air in the pod was tense as they all waited with bated breath. If they were discovered now, it was all over. The flashing lights filled up the dim space. Emergency lights provided another dull glow from along the walls and under the seats. The silence stretched on. The humans seemed to have finished whatever it was that they were doing. Slinking over to join Katsuki and Eri, Izuku slumped down into the seat next to the Trinitrox, leaning heavily into the seat with a small grunt. Their gaze flicked down to Eri, brow furrowing. Eri began only to be interrupted as the human leaned over, lifted her up by her armpits, and plopped her down onto their lap. Their hands carted worriedly through her hair and looked her over, as if searching for injuries, pausing only briefly to press their hand against her forehead. Once they were satisfied with her condition, the human turned their attention to Katsuki, who was just finishing up his distress signal. The cadet snarled at the human's probing fingers, though Izuku only relented when Katsuki gave a warning snap of his teeth that was a little too close for comfort. Aizawa didn't let this distract him. He was hyper-focused on the controls before him. The Pardus was ready for the smallest hint of danger. Their captor's ship was quickly disappearing and they had yet to make any suspicious moves. In fact, the whole ship seemed dead. It wasn't moving forward, simply floating through space. Most of its systems, including engines, were shut down. Not even lights could be seen. It was nothing more than a dark blob sitting in space. They were definitely trying to hide from something, and Aizawa wasn't about to hang out to find out what. He was simply going to use this opportunity it provided to escape. I got a response. Katsuki called. It's Imada. They are only a sector over and are inbound now. They have other GU vessels with them that were helping with the search. Good job, Katsuki, Aizawa rumbled. You hear that, Eri? Help is coming. Those sentients we left on the ship will be free. Why, yeah, she whimpered with barely concealed emotion. Thank you. The next few pullers passed in a strange haze. It wasn't a long time, barely even an eighth of a suicel, but it felt like eons. All of them stuck between dread and relief. It was only when friendly ships slowly started to blip into existence that they let themselves breathe. As ships exited lightspeed, they connected to Aizawa's ship, briefly collecting info on where the trafficker's ship was located before jumping back into light speed and entering quantum space. There and gone in an instant. Aizawa felt a heavy weight slip off his back as the UA cadet vessel flashed into existence before them, hailing them the moment they exited their jump. The Pardus was fairly certain the entire experience had sheared a few stellar rotations off his life. A deep breath hissed between his lips as he sagged into his seat. Slowly, he swiveled his chair around to observe his passengers. Katsuki and Eri were staring back at him. Both had hesitant looks of hope on their faces. They, along with Izuku, had remained in the seats they had initially claimed on the right-hand side of the shuttle. Katsuki's hands were still tightly clutching the datapad. Unlike the other two, Izuku was out. Aizawa wasn't sure if they were sleeping or unconscious. At some point Eri had wormed her way deeper into their lap. The human's arms were looped securely around her waist. She was even actively hugging their arms closer. She looked very pleased with her current position. Her glowing horn was a clear indication of that. The human's head of green curls had also fallen to the side, resting heavily on Katsuki's scaled shoulder. Contrary to the Trinitrox's disgusted scowl, he was leaning into the human's touch. "What?" the cadet snarled, ash gold crest bristling. Aizawa said nothing, only chuffed in amusement. "It's freezing in here and he's warm," Katsuki cried in defense of his dignity. Everyone froze when the human stirred awake, murmuring. A hazy green orb peeled open to glare darkly at the sentient they were treating as a headrest. With a huff the human tapped the end of the teen's snout firmly. A clear reprimand. Izuku didn't go back to sleep after their light scolding though. Instead they sat there, eyes drooping and dull. Now that they were all looking closer in the dim light, they could tell the discoloration under the human's eyes had grown even more pronounced. Izuku looked so starkly different from when they were first introduced it was unsettling. Was Izuku sick? A small nugget of worry wiggled its way into Aizawa's mind. Sure, he hadn't known Izuku long, but the human had been instrumental in their escape. Not to mention how kind they were to Aizawa's kids, plus, he hated to admit it, but when they weren't being brutally violent they were somewhat endearing. Clawed black paws clicked against the flooring as the Pardus moved over to the kids and their human. Izuku's gaze languidly flicked over to meet him. Aizawa crouched in front of them, gently removing the human's arms from Eri and shifting her to Katsuki's lap. "Is Izuku okay?" Eri questioned nervously. "I don't know," Aizawa replied honestly. Haltingly he raised his clawed hands to Izuku's face, cupping the human's cheeks and tilting their head to better inspect them. His hands carefully avoided the human's delicate neck, unsure how the human would react to him touching such a vulnerable area. Izuku didn't fight him. Simply let themselves be adjusted this way and that. One of Aizawa's black paw-like hands shifted to gently inspect the human's body, searching intently for any injuries. He didn't even have a clue how to identify human illness. He wasn't even sure how warm a human should be. He could, at the very least, find irregularities in the human's form that suggested injuries he might have missed before. Their head, despite the scabbed-over wound, seemed fine. Only a small bruise forming around where they had been hit and there was minimal swelling. Carefully he unzipped the human's sweater and revealed the skin underneath. Spots of discoloration stood out starkly on the unveiled skin. The bruises, while expected, were much larger than Aizawa had anticipated. A long winding burn wrapped around one of the human's arms, an obvious result of the shock they received from the very WHP they still have sitting on the seat next to them. The wound was red and puffy with what Aizawa assumed was irritation. During the inspection the pod docked with 1A. A series of clicks and clacks echoed in the chamber. They were accompanied by a jolt as the pod locked into place. The sudden jerking movements made the human lowly, their face screwing up slightly. Izuku sat rigid in an attempt to stay upright. They were mostly successful but they still bumped lightly into Katsuki's firm frame. To the teen's credit, he held his tongue. Instead he silently helped prop the human back up. He seemed to be on a roll these past few cycles when it came to holding his tongue. Aizawa would have to praise him for it later. Eri whimpered as she tried to crane to get a better look at the human. "Izuku," she called. This time she didn't receive an answer. The human didn't even seem to hear her as their eyes stayed clenched tight and their breathing stuttered. Worriedly Aizawa ran his hands over the human's torso, searching for broken bones. He didn't get far before the human cried out and jerked away from his hands. 2 hands snapped out and captured his in a vice. "No," the human groaned. Their head dropped down, hanging low as they tried to fight away Aizawa's probing fingers. A small wet cough rattled their teeth. It was quickly followed by a pained wheeze. "I'm sorry. I know it hurts, but I have to look." Izuku, Aizawa tried to soothe the human. He forced a slight purr into his voice. The human had liked the sound before, maybe it would help calm them down now. His efforts were for naught as the human refused to let his hands go. Aizawa was trying to work out how he was going to get the human to let him properly inspect their wounds when he heard Eri gasp. Darting his attention back to the human's face, he was met with the sight of a small trickle of crimson red leaking out from the corner of the human's mouth. For red eyes widened in horror. Katsuki's insistent questions about what was wrong fell on deaf ears. It was at that moment that Imada opened their pod door, practically throwing himself into the small space. "Aizawa, I was so dashed. Get me medical now." Izuku felt like he was floating. Everything around him was so muffled and distant. It would have been nice were it not for the simultaneously boiling and freezing sensation that was ravaging his flesh. Oh yeah, and that stabbing agony in his sisi and head and arm and just everywhere really. His mind felt hazy as his breaths breathed short and shallow out of him. He was finding it rather strong to just catch his breath. It was kinda like that time he had convinced one of his uncles to let him try riding this tall and cow-esque animal they found and sort of tamed on an uninhabited planet. He had seen the other members of the crew trying it out when his mom wasn't looking, and it looked like a lot of fun. It reminded him of the bull riding competitions on Earth, just much less deadly because they didn't seem to buck near as strong and certainly didn't hold a grudge after they knocked you off. Almost the second they got rid of the weight on their back, they calmed down again. He had beaten everyone else's times too. The brief victory was quickly spoiled when he threw up the hand he was using to cling to the tiring animal and let out a cheerful whoop. This unfortunately spooked the space giraffe cow creature and sent it bolting, which promptly unseated Izuku and sent him crashing to the ground. The fall hadn't been too dangerous by the teen standards, but it certainly had winded him for a few minutes. Also sent his mom screaming across the field since she chose that exact moment to reappear. He had been thoroughly scolded after that. His mom even threatened to get him a kitty leash, as if Izuku didn't know that she already had received one as a GG gift for her last birthday. She was probably only a few heart attacks away from digging it out of her closet and actually using it on him. Izuku was jarred out of his dazed musings when the weight that he hadn't realized was sitting nestled at his side suddenly jostled him. The abrupt movement, while not rough, sent jolts of pain racing across his body and punched the breath right out of his lungs. Just like that, a more tentative awareness took hold of his mind, slowly forcing him out of his head and into the real world. With a groan, green eyes fluttered open. He was met with the blurry sight of a gray, almost purple ceiling, which was odd considering he didn't remember their ship having purple tones in the color scheme. Did someone suddenly have the urge to redecorate? Sluggishly, Izuku turned his head to the side, breath still wheezing, as his brain tried to push through the pain and grogginess to work out why their ceilings were suddenly purple. The blurry sight that met him made his addled brain were uselessly with incomprehension. Near his bedside stood 2 figures that were most certainly not human. One of them was very strong to miss. They were rather tall and sported vibrant yellow fur, feathers. Whatever it was sort of thick, falling oddly over the creature's neck and as if concealing something. Resting on the fluffy neck was an equally fluffy head with black markings and a rounded bat-like snout. They looked like some sort of combination of a mammal and a bird, their rounded muzzle being tipped with a small beak. Just before the beak was a series of feathery-like whiskers sprouted, with a matching set of antenna-like feathers resting on their forehead. A large crest lifted up off of their head, adding a good foot or 2 to their height. 2 sets of ears rested on the sides of their head, one set slightly smaller than the other. From their arms sprouted countless large feathers, almost like they were wings of some sort. In the batbird's claws rested something that looked like a suspiciously oversized needle connected to a long tube. The sight of it made Izuku a little uncomfortable, but he couldn't gather why. Needles didn't usually bother him. Why would they now? The batbird was chattering ceaselessly, and maybe a little heatedly, with the other much smaller not human. This one would probably barely reach Izuku's waist. Barely. Their flesh was a soft creamy sort of pink with a spattering of black splotches. They almost kind of looked like freckles. Their face was broad with a taut mouth and beady eyes. A few tentacle-like things protruded from their head, twining above their head into what vaguely resembled a bun, another set curling around to cup their cheeks. Another series of tiny tentacles sat at the base of their spine, almost like a bunny tail made of short tentacles. Their hands were small and clawless, with only 4 stubby digits. They were almost like an axolotl. In a way, sort of. Neither of them appeared to notice Izuku was awake. Both seemingly too absorbed in babbling about the needle the bat-birds still clutched in their paws. Behind the figures, he could see small robots racing back and forth across the space. Their tiny arms loaded with supplies as they seemed to be prepping something. One of the little bots sat planted at the smaller exhaustive person's side, carefully presenting a tray covered in assorted bottles with a syringe tucked onto it, almost as an afterthought. What was going on? How did he get here? He was supposed to be with someone right now, right? Was it Mom? No, that didn't seem right. It was someone else. Wait, where was his mom again? Where was he again? A few amorphous shapes teased his memory. Blurs of black, white, yellow, green, and orange swirling in his mind. Izuku blinked languidly, eyes drifting off to stare into space. He was forgetting something. He knew it, but he was too tired to really connect the dots. His eyes wandered around the space, not entirely registering what he was seeing. That is until he realized he had been staring into wide goldish-green eyes for a good 5 minutes. The bat-like sentient was standing stiff as a boar hair and wasn't moving a muscle. Their eyes flicking nervously, as if afraid to hold his gaze too long. The limb not grasping desperately at the needle was yearning blindly for the tiny creature next to them, who just so happened to also be watching Izuku rather intently. Their stubby hands slowly descending to a device clipped to their hip. Slowly Izuku wobbled upwards into a sitting position, firmly ignoring every part of his body screaming at him. He listed dangerously to the side before righting himself and made another pained wheeze. What? He garbled intelligently. His eyes strayed from the other 2 beings in the room and landed on something he hadn't noticed before. Tucked up against his side was a small white form with a very familiar little branch-like horn. That explained why that side of his body felt so heavy. Oddly enough, the body didn't seem to really emit any heat, rather just seemed to leach the warmth from the air around them and from Izuku's body. It was airy. It was airy. Suddenly Izuku didn't find it all that strong to be wide awake. Nothing like a sudden burst of adrenaline to get the blood pumping in the morning? Izuku's hands flew to the kid, they were a kid right, nervously hovering over them and searching desperately for any injuries. Cold dread filled his stomach, pushing away the ache in his body. Oh God, the trafficking ship, that jail cell. Where were Kaken and Aizawa? Were they okay? Why was Eri here? Why weren't they in that escape pod anymore? Izuku jerked around to look at the other 2 sentients in the room. Green eyes landing on the needles and vials they seemed to be surrounding themselves in. The bat-bird took a tentative step forward, the hand with the massive needles shifting suspiciously behind their back while the other hand raised up in an almost placating manner. As if they could trick Izuku into thinking they weren't armed. Behind them Izuku could see the pink one trying to stealthily reach for some sort of device on their belt with a small assortment of buttons, black eyes darting to the tray of assorted bottles consideringly. Memories of a hauntingly similar scenario came rushing back to Izuku. Running through thick vegetation, hands clutching a branch stained with yellow blood and heart racing. Howls of pain chasing after him. The distant sounds of crashes and booms as he raced down the bustling hall, the ground shaking as screams rose in the air like a discordant choir. He would have taken them all, was ready to if it kept everyone else safe this time, but there were just too many. He needed his mom. He needed Auntie and a sudden sharp pain in his back followed by a drowsy feeling that was easily shaken off. That is until more of the sharp pains came dotting across his body and slowing his retreat. The mind-numbing fear as his body failed and darkness overcame him, only to wake up as they were loading him into a small shuttle. his limbs bound and mouth gagged. He only briefly heard his mother's wails in the distance, enraged and horrified, before they descended upon him with more needles filled with who knows what kinds of drags. If they thought Izuku was letting them anywhere near him and Eri with either of those needles, then they were in for a rude reality check. Being non-consensually drugged twice was more than enough for him, thank you. He only hoped his mother didn't hear about all this. He didn't need another, pugs not drags, presentation. The blonde sentient puffed up slightly, mouth opening and closing a few times, causing their beak to click, nervously? Or maybe it was a threat, Izuku couldn't tell. Soft green eyes hardened as he started to raise further off the bed, pushing Eri's scarily still form further behind him. The limpness of the pale sentient made Izuku pause. He hadn't really noticed before, but they hadn't moved at all since he got up. Even their Cittsah was still as death. Izuku felt so much in that moment that it was almost like he felt nothing at all. An anguish so great all it left behind was an empty void. Eri wasn't dead. They weren't. He refused to believe it. Something had woken him up. It had to have been Eri, right? Izuku just had to get them out of here, go find Aizawa and Katsuki, then signal his mom with the beacon again and everything would be fine. Mom would know what to do. She always knew what to do. Unbidden tears started collecting in Izuku's eyes. He didn't care enough to even consider trying to stop them. His attention snapped back when the other sentients in the room moved again. The little one had slunk backwards, digits on the device now clasped in their hand and mouth moving in a quiet murmur. Was it a communicator of some sort? That wasn't good. The blonde one had taken another hesitant step forward, quickly hiding the smaller sentient from Izuku's glare. Growling in warning and a little bit in pain, Izuku pushed the thin blankets aside. His body may ache like he'd been run over by a train, which then proceeded to park on top of him for good measure, but that didn't mean he was incapable of giving them hell. He fully intended to do so as well. They did something to Eri, now they had to pay. A sudden stillness fell over the room. The building pressure of prey and predator staring each other down, waiting for the first move to be made. The taut line of tension snapped when a new voice chimed from the pink sentient's communicator. It sounded familiar, but Izuku didn't have the time to consider that fact. It was all the prompting Izuku needed to launch himself clumsily off the bed. His landing was sloppy from the pain and his blurry vision, but he wasn't discouraged. The sound of footsteps thundering outside the closed door told Izuku that reinforcements the small one had been calling arrived. He knew he needed to act fast, injuries be med. The door hissed open right as the teen collided with the taller sentient, hands curled into claws and ready to gouge at their eyes. He clutched desperately at the willowy form, grabbing handfuls of fur to haul himself up the now shrieking sentient who was trying to pry the human off. Their efforts felt too weak though. They weren't even digging in their talons, and they seemed uncertain where to put their hands. The cry they were emitting was certainly jarring though. It made Izuku's ears ring and shoulders hunch up in a futile effort to block out the sound. A scarred hand loomed over the blonde's panicking face, poised to strike. They were both interrupted when that familiar voice returned. This time it came from the door. "Izuku!" the voice exclaimed. The teen jerked to a sudden stop, slowly turning to face who had called his name. None of his kidnappers should know his name. How did they know his name? He made quite the sight, grappling a willowy batbird who was squawking and flailing. His wide eyes were streaming with tears, and the hand that was once ready to strike was limp. Even through the burning tears that shrouded his vision, Izuku immediately recognized the black blob in front of him. "Aizawa!" Izuku cried as he detached himself from his still struggling perch and staggered towards the cat person. The second Aizawa had gotten the emergency call from SO. He had shaken off his still clinging cadets and started sprinting down the halls. Her wizened voice carried an undertone of worry as she tried to relay to Aizawa what was going on. "I do not think the humans' reactions are matching the welcoming ones you described, Aizawa. They appear disoriented and, oh dear," she murmured. Aizawa felt his heart's thunder as he picked up his pace. Before he could even think about asking what was wrong, the elder started up again, tone even more hushed than before. "They have just discovered Eri and appear rather, I believe, distressed? I don't like them moving about this much." Please do hurry before they hurt themselves more. They also appear to be having a reaction to something. Their eyes are watering profusely. Perhaps they are sensitive to a compound here in the med bay. I appear to have been spotted. My, what vibrant eyes they have. Underneath those intrigued, if worried, ramblings, Aizawa could hear Imada nervously chatter and click at the human. Each attempt to soothe the human falling on deaf ears and the tone apparently going ignored because Imada was growing more terrified with each passing pulsec. The human remained eerily silent. They were no longer babbling like Aizawa had grown accustomed to. In his experience, the human only got like that right before an attack. What is the human doing right now? Have they shown any signs of aggression? Aizawa demanded as he rounded a corner too quickly, shoulders slamming into the wall as he continued his desperate sprint. He knew he shouldn't have accepted their offer to take a small break to reassure his students and get some actual food for himself. Imada had promised him that he would take over helping So in finding out what exactly the best way to treat the human was. They had convinced him that should the human wake up, Eri would be enough to keep them calm. The human had adored her after all. For whatever reason, the resting Eri wasn't enough though. Did something else set them off? Maybe the unfamiliar faces? Suddenly a lot of things happened at once. So made an aborted yelping sound, a loud thump and shuffle, and then Imada was screeching. Aizawa had maybe heard that exact call a few times in his life, but he identified it immediately for what it was. A distress call. One used by the Yekali species to warn others of danger. It was also used as a cry for help. Despite the short distance from the cafeteria, it felt like it took forever to reach the medbay. Each moment was filled with Imada's screeches and So dropping the communicator to fumble with something else. Finally, the door was within sight. Aizawa practically crashed into it, jamming at the control panel. After many harsh jabs, the door relented and slid open. The sight that met him was an utter disaster. So was crouched low, trying to prep what looked like a sedative. Imada was currently experiencing a hostile takeover by Izuku as they clung to his yellow fur. The human was clearly ready to rain their wrath down upon Imada. So Aizawa opened his mouth and, in his best scolding voice, barked, "Izuku!" It was rather close to the tone he used with his misbehaving students, which hardly seemed an appropriate response to the apparent maiming that was about to occur. But the tone was basically instinct at this point. It worked too because the human screeched to halt. Tense muscles loosened up and that curly-haired head turned to face him. Like So said, their eyes were visibly watering. Exactly why that was happening was so far beyond Aizawa. At this point he wouldn't even try to consider it until after this disaster was sorted. They still looked incredibly pale. Now that Aizawa was really looking, he recognized that the change in coloration wasn't a good sign. There was a slight tremor in the human's hands that hadn't been there before as well. As if their body was physically rebelling against the unconsciousness that had previously held it hostage. Their breathing was irregular as well, rapid and shallow. Aizawa was only given a few short pulsecs to gather all of this information before the human suddenly dropped from Imada and hobbled over to Aizawa. It was a rather speedy hobble at that. Painful looking but speedy. Imada practically whimpered as the human wrapped their arms around Aizawa instead. Though, it was different from how he saw the human would attach themselves to their enemies before. That knowledge was the only thing that kept Aizawa still. The Pardus certainly felt himself tense up at the contact, but he did not struggle. His bravery paid off too as he felt the human settle against him. Their touch was gentle and they emitted some soft snuffling sounds as they burrowed into the flight suit he hadn't been able to change out of yet. Their head tucking itself tight under his chin. It put their mouth uncomfortably close to his neck, but it wasn't an inherently aggressive gesture. Something about the way the human clung to him, the sounds they were making, pulled at Aizawa's instincts, but he couldn't quite place what it was. Aizawa heard more than saw Imada preparing to intervene and save him from feral human, but he stopped him swiftly. "It's all right," he rumbled, a slight purr beginning to enter his voice as he tried to calm the human. "They aren't trying to hurt me." As if to prove his point, Aizawa slowly raised a clawed hand to the human's back and hesitantly returned the gesture. With a quick disapproving glance in Nisao's direction, he added, "There will be no need for that either. It probably wouldn't do much either. Except make them mad." Slowly the medic lowered the sedative-filled syringe in her hand. She gave him a brisk nod before turning back to her bot helpers, instructing them to give the human more space and get her equipment ready. The humans sagged against Aizawa, their legs seeming to give out on them a small bit before regaining their footing. Then the human pulled back, legs still shaky and eyes looking wet. Clawless hands grasped at Aizawa as the human started to pull him to the bed where Eri still lay, though not without a suspicious glance towards the room's two other occupants. The whole way their mouth was chattering as well as they could through gasps of air. If he ignored the odd breathing pattern, it was a much more familiar and friendly sound. Then the humans seemed to realize using their native tongue was futile and quickly such tactics. Eri, the humans stuttered, face growing paler the longer they stood. Eri. The Pardus allowed himself to be pulled along, willing to go along with the human as long as it kept them docile. What about Eri, Izuku? The man rumbled. The human hit the edge of the bed and stumbled, hauling themselves up with a concerning wheeze. Their hands still somehow firmly gripping Aizawa as they tried to haul him closer. Eri. They crawled across the bed reaching for the resting pelvis. Imada's beak clicked agitatedly behind them. Should you really let the human? It's fine. Aizawa interrupted, eyes watching the human critically. They seemed distressed about Eri for some reason. Suddenly Aizawa remembered the device he had brought back with him from the smuggler's ship. Scanning around the room, he found it resting on a small table next to the bed where he had initially left it. When he had finally had the time to inspect it, he had been pleasantly surprised to find that the data pad was already equipped with a somewhat up-to-date translation software. He was also frustrated, however, when he discovered it had no functioning speakers. Likely a result of the fall it took when he commandeered it from its original owner. So, the device could listen to and translate speech to text, but it could not audibly translate in real time. Unfortunate, but it was marginally better than any translation devices they currently had on the ship. If only because it actually was new enough to be automatically programmed to have a rudimentary understanding of the human language. As a training vessel, there was certain equipment that was just deemed unnecessary for cadets to have. They never could have anticipated the ship needing the ability to translate the human language because in a regular situation they would have avoided their cadets encountering humans entirely. Most ships, regardless of their purpose or designation, would actively avoid human vessels. At the very most, the cadets would have hesitantly been allowed to observe how interactions with humans went in the final legs of their training, several eclipses from now. The last thing everyone needed was some brash cadet upsetting a human and causing an intergalactic incident. The translating devices they currently had on board were technically capable of downloading data for human language, but that would take more time than they currently had at the moment to locate such files and upload them. Humans were somewhat rare, and as a result finding programs that could thoroughly and reliably translate was slightly more challenging than some other languages. They also couldn't safely hijack the data from the pad he had. At least not before scanning the device more thoroughly to look for any nasty traps first. In all honesty, Aizawa should have immediately set one of his cadets to the task. Unfortunately, in the rush of getting the human to the medical ward, making sure Katsuki and Eri were looked over and fed properly, trying to soothe his other cadets, and just getting a couple pulsecs to breathe meant the task fell to the wayside. They had all foolishly assumed the human's injuries would keep them bedridden if not unconscious. His inattentiveness now made him cuss himself out internally. Calmly, Aizawa sat on the bed next to Izuku, putting himself on their level as they continued to wheeze Eri's name. Seeming to get more desperate with each repetition. They paused for a moment when Aizawa chuffed softly in an attempt to placate the human. Wait, Izuku, let me get this thing on. It will help you talk to me. Black claws clicked away at the screen as he navigated the device, and quickly set it to detect and translate from basic to human and vice versa. Can you tell me what's wrong, Izuku? Aizawa rumbled hesitantly into the device. It took barely a pulsec for the device to process his voice and rapidly fill the screen with unfamiliar blocky letters. He flipped the screen, making sure to hold the screen directly in Izuku's line of sight. The human stuttered to a stop. It was like watching an old machine sputter and chug itself back to life as his somewhat glassy eyes seemed to sharpen slightly with focus. The human pulled Eri into their lap, still apparently ignoring their injuries, and cradled her head delicately. This time when Izuku spoke, he didn't limit himself to calling their names. He kept his babbling short and concise. When the human was done, Aizawa flipped the device around, scanning over the much more familiar flowing characters of Basic. Something's wrong with Eri. I don't think they're breathing. The human's eyes cut over to Imada and Skio, stare almost accusatory. Understanding washed over Aizawa. Izuku had woken up in an unfamiliar place, probably still sensitive due to their previous imprisonment. Then he had found two of his companions missing and the youngest of them unresponsive and seemingly not breathing. It was probably Eri's condition that had been the final trigger for the human. He had seen on the smuggler's ship that the human had strong pack instincts, which resulted in it being very protective of younglings. Aizawa knows he wouldn't have been the most amenable had he woken up in a strange place with sentients he didn't know and his ward seemingly hurt. Combine those feelings with a human's proclivity for violence and you get the disaster that was about to unfold before he arrived. Izuku, Aizawa called in an attempt to get the human's attention back on him. Eri is okay? As their eyes dart across the screen, the human's face scrunches in a way that Aizawa would hesitantly call doubtful? At least he thinks it's doubtful based on his limited experience with their expressions. I promise that she's okay, he soothes. You helped bring her onto our ship safely? Aizawa pauses for a beat before slowly extending his hand, silently requesting the human's hand as he continued, Here, can I show you something? Izuku looks down at Eri, still cradled safely in their arms, before reluctantly relinquishing one to Aizawa's hold. The Pardus is gentle as he guides the human to Eri's arm first, encompassing her tiny arm with the human's hand. With the human's current health, their hand felt almost limp. Their skin was scarred and palms calloused in places, physical proof of the strength that usually rests in their hands. Though what Aizawa's mind caught on the most was the size. When they were trapped in that cell with Izuku, they seemed so large but so small at the same time. A tiny giant that fearlessly clashed with anything in their path. But in this moment, the hand that was clasped under his felt small in a very different way. Shaking away those intrusive thoughts, Aizawa continued, Eri comes from a plant-based species, so she doesn't breathe in the way that you or I do. You can't squeeze her arm too tight, but if you pay really close attention you can feel her body circulating her equivalent of BLD. The human is silent for a long moment, eyes laser-focused on their hands and only deviating to read Aizawa's words. Then their lips parted to mumble shakily. Eri's okay? The screen read. Yes. Eri's okay. Aizawa confirmed. The human promptly, and rather violently, burst into tears. It was so abrupt Aizawa felt like he had been stun-locked for a moment. Brain scrambling to catch up with what was happening in front of his eyes. Another indiscernible sound came from Izuku, and out of the corner of his eye Aizawa saw the tablet flash the words, language not recognized. Helplessly he turned to the other two conscious bodies in the room, as if to ask them what the crek he was witnessing. Aizawa was met with matching baffled stares. Don't look at me. Imada squawked, golden fur still mussed up from earlier. I'm even more confused than you. Skio, benevolent being that she was thankfully much more helpful. She mused as she waddled over to the human's bedside. Aizawa's presence seemed to embolden her enough to believe the human wouldn't resort to violence once more. She pushed a stool with her, hopping up on the surface as she got closer. It would appear that the tears may not be a response to irritants. Perhaps it's an emotional response? Either way, I can't in good conscience let the human go longer without treatment. Their condition is very obviously worsening. Observing the human once more, Aizawa felt a small pang of guilt. Clearly the human cared a great deal about Eri to respond so strongly. Not to mention the human's voice and breathing still sounded horrible, and probably was getting worse by the minute with how rough the human had been on themselves. That's not even mentioning the discolored bruises and burns that still covered their skin like patchwork. Izuku was still curled around Eri when Aizawa moved his hand up to carefully clasp the human's shoulder. At the same time he called the human's name. He had to repeat himself a few times to get their attention. When tearful eyes finally turned to him, Aizawa gestured to the tablet. Izuku, this is Skio. She is a crewmate of mine and a medic. The sentient over there is another one of our crewmates, Imada, he explained. The human's attention slowly drifted over to the pale pink Bistaxica next to him. To Skio's credit, she stood unflinchingly under the human's scrutiny. "Hello, Izuku. Would it be all right if I were to get closer to give you a look over? You came to my medbay in rather rough condition." The human nodded, thankfully, their previous suspicious glare abating after being properly introduced. They murmured out a short answer while slowly shuffling Eri over to Aizawa, making room for Skio to do a proper checkup. "Okay. Sorry, about earlier," the datapad read back to them. Skio gave an amused huff as she scooted closer. "Don't worry about it, dearie. Imada can handle a scare or two, just please refrain from climbing on him like that again. He can be rather sensitive." She joked as she called over one of her helper bots. Imada's offended gasps sounded from across the room, but none of them paid him any mind. He didn't seem inclined to come closer and make his complaints known either. An arachnid-esque robot scuttled over to Skio's side, holding up a tray covered in basic examination tools which she sorted through quietly. "I'm sorry to say I am not overly familiar with humans, so I may need your help to make sure you get the proper treatment. But first, can you tell me what hurts the most?" she asked as she pulled out a scanner. The human took a moment to mull this over. Aizawa had to stop himself from letting out an incredulous sigh when Izuku also saw it necessary to run their hands over themselves, as if reminding themselves of exactly where all their injuries were before they answered. And what an answer it was that they received, because the tablet quickly filled in with the human's rasped-out answer. "My ribs. I broke some ribs. Maybe a punctured lung? Like just a little bit. My lung probably didn't see collapse." The response was concise with short spaced-out sentences, but despite that it still took a little bit for the human to get it all out, which was likely a direct result of the human's current trouble breathing and speaking, because they evidently broke their ribs, which were now stabbing their internal organs. Because of course the human's body had to start attacking itself now that it has run out of any other suitable targets. What else should Aizawa have expected? That's not to say broken ribs that compounded into worse injuries were unheard of in other species. But Izuku's lack of concern was, well, concerning. Then the human continued. "The burns aren't a big deal, only a couple blisters, so probably not bad. Like mild second degree, I wouldn't worry about them. Don't worry about the bruises either. Oh, and maybe a concussion. I've had worse." Aizawa shared a long pained look with Skio before they turned back to their patient. He did not envy the Bistaxica for having to try to treat a human with little to no knowledge on what remedies and medicines were safe. At the very least, they had the human's cooperation and the human's questionably reliable ability to report on their own injuries. "When would you look at that? The human has started to cough up BLD wonderful." Aizawa needed a raise and a vacuum because at this rate he was going to shed all his fur from the stress. Aizawa groaned as he slumped into the chair next to the human's bed. Eri had long since been moved to her own bed in the med bay. It felt like it had taken several pullers to examine and treat the human. The franticness of the situation had been heavily contrasted by the measured pace they had to take. Every little thing they had done had been calculated and slow, waiting to see how the human's body reacted to each minute step. Skio had ultimately decided to rule out using any kind of sedative or pain reliever on the human, since they really had no clue what would help and what would harm. It had been what Skio had been discussing with Imada when the human had woken up the first time around. Izuku had also grown tired and didn't really seem to want, or be able to, talk much after explaining their injuries after the first assessment. They were, however, still willing to answer questions. Evidently this was not the first time the human had broken their ribs, honestly not surprising in Aizawa's opinion, so the human was able to talk Skio through what they knew. The doctor had been especially skeptical when the human's treatment plan boiled down to 1, don't wrap my ribs, 2, deep breathing, and 3, interrupt my sleep every once in a while because of the head injury, which seemed incredibly bare bones in both of their opinions. Surely humans must have some medicines and treatments to speed along the process? It was especially frustrating to Skio since her current methods were off the table. Plus, that wasn't even including the human's brief but unhelpful, "If I get an air in my you gotta poke a hole," which Aizawa promptly decided to not think too strong about. After Skio had gotten Izuku to a somewhat more stable state, the human had promptly passed out again. Aizawa was a lot, jealous because he felt about as exhausted as the human had looked. Alas, he couldn't rest because now he had a whole new problem to solve. A problem which happened to be, what in the stars am I supposed to do with a whole cracking human on my ship? He had already relayed everything to Headmaster Nezuyu when they had first set foot on their training vessel again. But, as usual, the sentient had left him hanging with a vague, "Oh dear, let me look into this." Then he promptly cut off their call. So now here Aizawa sat, keeping watch over their newly acquired human, and wondering what he had done to find himself in this fine mess. They would be lucky if they didn't have an intergalactic incident on their hands with this. Hopefully Izuku's apparent fondness for them could at least appease the rest of the humans when they found out about this. Aizawa's ear flicked as he heard the sound of another chair being dragged up to his. He didn't have to look to know who it was. The nervous clack of a beak and constant low tittering sounds let him know it was Imada. It seemed like the sentient was incapable of being quiet most of the time. The Yekali fell heavily into the chair next to him. So, a human? Yes, a human. Care to state anything else obvious? Aizawa grumbled weakly. Imada warbled in amusement, ducking his head low and ears flicking down in a mockery of an apology. Sorry, he said, it was just very unexpected. First you and Katsuki get kidnapped right out from under us. Don't ever worry me like that again, by the way. But then you suddenly turn up in a stolen escape pod with a little albino pulvis and a feisty human in tow? The Yekali shifted closer to Aizawa, pressing his feather like fur pressing up against him in a comforting manner. Honestly, you hate trouble so much you were the last person I ever expected to get tied up with a human. Huffing, Aizawa sunk lower into his seat. Well, I didn't really have a choice this time. They aren't what I expected. The human, Izuku. They aren't what I expected. Imada didn't press Aizawa for more, simply letting his companion gather his thoughts. The quiet reigned for a moment as they both watched the resting human. Long dark lashes resting over rounded cheeks as they huffed and puffed in their bed. You know, the yellow sentient began. Weirdly kind of cute. In like, a small feral creature kind of way. Aizawa wasn't given a chance to respond because immediately after both their comm units began to go off. The men startled, quickly answering the call to stop the shrill beeping. In their bed Izuku stirred a little face scrunching up and then smoothing out moments later. A low murmur left their lips as they fell still once more. The screens on the devices lit up, displaying Nezuyu's small white form. As usual, he seemed a little too placidly pleased for the current situation they found themselves in. No matter the crisis, it was rare to see the headmaster shaken up in any way. No one really knew what species Nezuyu was, or even what planet he hailed from. Something that the sentients seemed to take great joy in. Some speculated that he was some kind of hybrid of several different species. Others concocted conspiracy theories of the genius sentient coming from an unknown planet not advanced enough to achieve space travel, and therefore not smart enough to keep him entertained. So, he simply took to the stars himself in search of other species to torment, leaving the rest of his people in the dust. Oh good. You two are already together. Nezuyu cheered. Abruptly Imada's communicator cut out. I have a rather fascinating, if maybe concerning, update for you too. Narrowing his eyes at the headmaster, Aizawa tentatively asked, What do you mean? Does it involve getting Izuku back to where they belong without causing a war? In a way. Nezuyu chirped, This is about what you were telling me earlier about the ship you were taken hostage on Aizawa. I do believe we have some more pieces to the puzzle. You mentioned the ship being understaffed and taking measures to potentially cloak their presence in your report? Correct? Yes, I did. Nezuyu, I understand the importance of investigating the smuggling ship, but we have a human on a ship full of younglings, so we really need. Aizawa was cut off by his boss before he could finish. This is all related, I promise you. You see, since our last call a lot has happened. First and foremost, that smuggling ship you were on was already ransacked and most of its crew killed before we could even try and take them into custody. There was an abrupt shift in the atmosphere. Nezuyu's beady black eyes stared grimly back at them. He no longer seemed so amused. Beside him Imada choked, fur fluffing up in surprise. Aizawa wasn't faring much better at concealing his own surprise, as his own fur puffed and tail lashed in kind. What about the other sentients held prisoner on the ship? Aizawa asked, worried about the answer. He would hate to think that they had left them all to die. He did it to protect his younglings, but that still didn't make the guilt any less sharp. All of the other prisoners were left unharmed. In fact, they were all in the process of evacuating from the ship via the escape pods when we arrived. But that's jumping ahead. There are some important details leading up to their escape. Nezu shuffled around on the screen, seemingly tapping away at a device that was out of frame. This all starts with your escape. When your escape pod disengaged from the smuggler ship, and briefly before you released your emergency signal, an uncone signal appeared and started almost riding on your own like a Zyterian tick. It was so cleverly hidden it had almost been overlooked by the vessels out on the search and rescue mission for you and Katsuki. However, Imada showed his expertise in communications once more and caught the signal. Imada preened slightly at the praise. In all honesty, he deserved it too. He had a true talent in communication tech that had saved them on more than one occasion. A brief analysis sheet for the signal they picked up appeared next to Nezu on the screen. As you can see, this signal is unlike any standard communications in the Galactic Federation. After looking over it myself, I have concluded that this is a human distress signal. One likely sent out by the human currently in your care. Shortly after this signal was released, a new ship appeared in the sector, quickly outpacing the ships that had been on their way to you and your captors. While I don't have any active footage of what happened, I can confirm it was a human ship. One that swiftly disabled the smuggler ship and boarded. The creeping sense of dread that had been lurking at the edges of Aizawa's awareness suddenly felt like a knife pressed to his throat. To think they had been that close to encountering a human ship. How would they have reacted to finding an unconscious Izuku in the escape pod with them? Would they have killed first and asked questions later? From there I can only assume they tore through the remaining smugglers on the ship, all while releasing the sentients kept captive as they went. By the time we got there, the humans were already gone and the smuggler ship was playing this distress call on loop. Just like that, Nezu disappeared, replaced with footage of a shadowed room that looked a lot like the cockpit of the smuggler ship. A frantic Chiata was on the screen, eyes wide and arms twitchy from fear. The only light came from behind them, where some sort of plasma tool appeared to be slowly and methodically slicing through the door. The Chiata's large frame blocked most of the view of the door. But the purplish-white light of the tool still cast an eerie halo around the distressed sentient. Questing emergency backup? The humans found us. I don't know how. Our secondary ship that had been deployed for evasive measures fell silent several pillars ago. They were supposed to lead the humans away, but something went wrong. I think the H-humans got them, and now a bang from behind the door. Oh crek, now they've come for us too. Please, we need reinforcements from any available SH Hasiac ships. They dash. There was a sudden heavy clanging as the door gave way. What happened over the next few pulsecs was a blur. A long, sharp bolt pierced through one of the larger hands of the Chiata. The limb had been wildly gesticulating moments before impact, but now BLD was spraying across the screen as they screamed in pain and knocked over their communicator. The camera tumbled for a while before coming to a stop, providing a perfect, though crooked, view of what was about to happen. A human entered the room, a gun-like weapon hoisted on their hip. Only it wasn't a gun at all. It had a trigger, but where a standard barrel would usually be, instead there was long, flattish barrel with a groove in the middle. Kind of like a rail. At the end there was a semicircle with some kind of string connecting the two ends. On the human's other hip sat an open container with more bolts like the one that had previously been fired. The human also wore a translator strapped to their neck with the connecting earpiece hooking over the back of their ears. The Chiata cowered against the controls of the ship as the human lurked into the room. In any other circumstance, Aizawa would have said this human looked soft, the gentle curves of their features alluding to a tender nature. However, in this very moment the human looked more like a predator than anything else. They were short, probably shorter than Izuku, and they bore a striking resemblance to the human in their care as well. The soft facial features paired with blackish-green hair made Aizawa think that they might be related in some way. Another very large human-shaped shadow darkened the doorway, but did not come. seemingly content to watch the scene play out as other presumably human shadows paced back and forth behind the door. "Where is he?" the human roared, loading another bolt into their weapon. The string creaked ominously. Don't play games with me. Where is he? Where is Izuku? I don't see. The Chiata grunted as the human descended upon him, cracking him across the face with their fist and grabbing a hold of his plating to hoist him into their face. The human's teeth were bared and face practically red with what Aizawa assumed was rage. There hung like a long dark curtain around their face. The massive size difference between the two sentients was in a way comical. The tiny human jerking around the massive Chiata. But the feeling lasted only for a brief moment as the severity of the situation washed back over Aizawa. "You have 5 seconds to tell me what you've done with him before I introduce this bolt to your eating kneecap." 1. Wait. Who are you dash? Do you mean the human? The human growled, green eyes narrowing. A sharp click thunk filled the air as the human's weapon discharged, sending the bolt flying at the side of their captive's knee. The bolt tore through armor and sinew, leaving a large weeping gash. Fortunately for the brute, the human had avoided the bone. The resulting scream made Aizawa and Imade's fur stand on end, scrambling to cover the speakers on the communicator in fear of waking the human or Eri. "I am not here to play games with you. Tell me where he is because I won't miss next time." The sentient choked on their panic for a moment, struggling weakly against the human's hand that still held them so close to their face. After a few minutes they finally managed to speak, sputtering out, The trigger creaked under the human's grasp. He escaped. I promise I'm not lying. He stole an escape pod and left not long before you arrived." The human paused, poisonous green eyes narrowing, as if evaluating the truthfulness of his words. Then very slowly they leaned in closer. For a moment Aizawa thought the human was going to bite the Chiata, but then they hissed, "If you are lying to me I will hunt you down, cut out your miserable lying tongue, and flay you alive." Their voice wasn't raised like earlier. It was low and even, as if the human was simply stating a fact. "That freight-class ship is big, the stars are bright. If you lie to me I will make you beg for the escape of death." Then the human punched the trafficker across the face. With a sharp crunch he was out cold and slumped to the ground. The human then steadily stood to their full gaze SW&G around the room. They can all detect the exact moment that the human's eyes lock onto the fallen communicator. They prowled over to it, stooping low to retrieve the communicator and bring it close to their face. Up close like this Aizawa could make out every minute detail of the human's face, and their resemblance to Izuku only became all the more apparent. The main stark differences between the two was this human lacked Izuku's spots and their coloring was not as vibrant. But there also seemed to be a difference in age between the two, as if this human was more worn with time. That feeling was tickling at the back of Aizawa's head again. He was missing something. The human glanced off screen, the sound of another human chattering at them briefly before their attention turned back to the device. When they spoke they seemed to be half addressing the other human, half addressing the recording. An SOS? Well, I suppose we will have to finish the call for them. The human turned pacing around the room agitatedly. "I don't know who orchestrated all this, but I want to make one thing clear. You've fed with the wrong mother. When I find you I am going to teach you the meaning of the word agony." With each word they became more worked up, spittle flying from gnashing teeth. "And if I find out that you have hurt my baby in any way, that you are still holding him captive, I will pull your lungs out through your back like wings and hang you with your own entrails." There was a beat of silence as the human's expression lightened, a soft, loving expression as the human cooed, "And Izuku, my baby, if you are seeing this don't be scared. Mama's coming." Then the feed cut out, replaced with a black void of nothing. Aizawa stared blankly at the screen as his mind slowly registered the implications of what he just heard. The clues that had gradually clicking into place suddenly slammed together to reveal the full picture. Baby. The human called Izuku their baby. Which meant, oh dear galaxies above and below, they were all going to die. They had a human youngling on their ship. A kidnapped human youngling. A hurt human youngling whose parent was currently on a warpath looking for him. Aizawa wasn't ignorant. He had heard about what happened to sentients who threatened human offspring. What still happened to people who threatened human offspring? Nizu's face flickered back into existence on the communicator as Imada and Aizawa shared horrified looks. The faint grumbling of Izuku stirring in their bed made them slowly turn their heads to the young human. The child. One of the human's eyes was halfway open, looking foggily around the room before uttering one short word. The datapad that was now resting on the table next to the human lit up once more. As one word, one innocent yet world-shattering word, stared mockingly up at them. Mama? If Aizawa hadn't been sitting, his legs surely would have given out on him. He stared wide-eyed at Izuku as he slowly stirred awake. His face muzzy with sleep as he lingered in a state halfway between conscious and unconscious. He seemed to be lazily scanning the room, no doubt searching for the source of his mother's voice. The youngling didn't seem disappointed when he couldn't find her. Aizawa was willing to bet he wasn't awake enough to really remember that he was on a strange ship surrounded by unfamiliar sentients and separated from his family. When the human's bright green eyes fell on them, Aizawa felt Imada shift anxiously next to him. Yellow fur beginning to stand on end again. The Yekli was getting worked up for nothing though. The human simply dopily bared his teeth once more and then snuggled deeper into his blankets and quietly dozed. Aizawa quietly reassured Imada that the human showing their teeth in that specific way was a friendly gesture. All the while his thoughts were racing. They had welcomed what was essentially a live explosive onto their ship full of youngling cadets. A live explosive who was himself a youngling. A youngling who Aizawa had just allowed to fight so they could all escape a highly dangerous and influential trafficking organization. The guilt and stress made Aizawa feel sick. Had he known, he would have never allowed the human to fight off their captors like he had. Especially not on his own. He also would not have taken the human straight back to his own students. He would have insisted the human be transferred to an actual peacekeeper vessel and not to a training one. Nizu was the first to break the silence, having heard the faint sounds the youngling made. "Is our human friend awake now?" Nervously Imada replied, "Sort of, or well he was." He leaned hesitantly closer, trying to work out exactly how awake the human was. Chittering inquisitively and receiving a sleepy mumble in return. Aizawa tilted the screen slightly to include Izuku in the frame. He already knew the principal was probably dying to inspect the human. He, much like the rest of the galaxy, didn't often get to be up close and personal with a human for extended PRDs. Their headmaster was first and foremost an inquisitive mind that voraciously picked apart anything new. Sure enough, the second the human entered the frame, Nizu's eyes were pulled to his sleeping form. It was like watching a meteoroid succumb to the inescapable pull of a black hole. "Well, I would very much like to speak to him," the headmaster chirped. "We will need him to make sure things play out properly." Nizu didn't turn away from the human for a moment, even as he started typing something they couldn't see. "The longer we let his mother simmer, the higher the chance she has a volatile reaction. We need to tell the humans he is safe before she, and subsequently the rest of her group, get even more angry and aggressive. Using the original signal Izuku dropped, we can contact them directly instead of trying to search the signals in the sector. When I do that, we will need Izuku awake and present to reassure his mother that he is both safe and unharmed. That should be enough to convince her we are not the enemy. In theory." He paused for a moment, eyes reluctantly darting over his screens before slingshotting back to the human. Aizawa hated it when he did this. The headmaster was a genius. There was no doubt about that. But in times like these he always had underlying motivations known only to himself. They often wouldn't know what he was after till the dust settled. Even then it wasn't always guaranteed that he would let them in on what the scheme was actually about. Aizawa was positive the headmaster had a much larger goal than just returning the human child, and it worried him. Based on how the headmaster spoke, Aizawa could safely assume Nezu wanted something from the humans. Though that wasn't a strong leap of logic to make. Maybe he was trying to establish human connections? From a sentient relations perspective, this whole situation presented them with an astronomical opportunity. Chances to establish positive relationships with humans were few and far between. They had been an insular group so far, mistrustful of most attempts to establish any kind of rapport. It is expected at this point for any friendly gestures to be rebuffed or ignored by humans. Not like anyone could really blame them, though. The humans' introduction to other sentients and the galaxies as a whole had been from a very violent and bloody invasion. Granted, their invaders took the heaviest losses in the end, if the reports are to be believed. The fact still remains that they had received no outside aid. Whereas other civilizations would have received supplies and medics at the very least, humans had nothing. They weren't even aware there were bodies like the Galactic Federation and peacekeepers to help them until after they had chased off their invaders. It was something that still filled Cittsah with righteous indignation to this day. Humans might be weird and frightening, but they didn't deserve what they got. Critics of the Galactic Federation often openly speculated how many lives were lost because they refused to let the United Corps of Intergalactic Peacekeepers get involved. Cittsah himself hadn't been shy about participating in such conversations. Peacekeepers existed for exactly those kinds of situations, and still the Federation interfered with their mobilization. What was the point of Cittsah and his colleagues training as peacekeepers if they wouldn't let them do their jobs when it mattered most? I have instructed Gyro and Dinky to work on updating one of our translation comms with the human language. It should make things much smoother than that datapad you have been using. As soon as it is up and running, which should be shortly, I want contact to be made. Preferably with you present, Cittsah. The Pardus nodded in agreement, though his flattened ears showed all present how he really felt about being involved. It made logical sense for him to be present. The slightest sign of discomfort from Izuku could set off his mother and the rest of their pack? The exact nature of Izuku's relation to the rest of the humans was unclear. In all likelihood, there had to be some degree of affection between those other humans and Izuku. In Cittsah's experience, it was strong to spend time around younglings and not care about their well-being. Which ship will we be transferring to for the call and subsequent handoff? Cittsah asked. Oh, Izuku won't be transferring ships. What? Cittsah and Imada cried at the same time, momentarily forgetting the younglings they were trying to let rest. Imada quickly slapped a hand over both of their muzzles, staring at their wards worriedly. Neither of them seemed bothered. Not surprising in Aries' case, but a concerning indicator of just how tired Izuku was. Quietly, Cittsah repeated, "What do you mean we won't be transferring him? Nezu, there are younglings on this ship, and you want to lead a raging group of humans right to them." Of all the reckless dash, Nezu cut in, putting a paw to his tea as he turned to address his subordinates, finally putting all his attention on them. "You both know I would never put our cadets under any unnecessary risk." Cittsah was about to violently refute that, but he was silenced by a stern look from his boss. "I have taken a long time to consider this situation, and I truly believe this could have a net gain for us all. In fact, if my hypotheses are correct, doing this on a cadet ship will give us the most peaceful outcome. I understand your concerns. Humans have a history of being unpredictable. But I think you've already seen that they aren't what they have been painted to be by the rest of the galaxies." Nezu gave Izuku a lingering look. "Izuku has shown you that they are capable of becoming valuable and loyal allies. Before us right now is a historical chance to start bridging the gap to coexist amicably with the humans." Cittsah stared calculatingly at Nezu, fur bristling as he searched for any indicator of uncertainty in those black beady eyes. Of course he found none. It was infuriating how self-assured the little white fiend was. Patting Cittsah's arm reassuringly, Imada piped up, "What makes you think calling the humans to a cadet vessel is the best plan? No offense, but I've already experienced what a human youngling will do in a fit of violence. I don't need a refresher from his mother, especially with our cadets present." "Simple," Nezu chortled. "My research has suggested that humans may have a weak spot for children, even ones who are not members of their own species. Obviously, these findings are based on a handful of eyewitness accounts and not guaranteed to be accurate on their own. But one must also consider that Izuku may have lived with this crew. There is no conceivable way those smugglers managed to snatch him from Earth. Not with how viciously their home planet is being guarded. No, I believe Izuku and his mother have been traveling around with these humans, so they are accustomed to having a youngling around to look after. They definitely seem to actively be helping Izuku's mother search for him. All of that is the long way to say there is a strong indication that we have a crew of humans situationally and potentially culturally primed to be sensitive to the safety and care of younglings. Which means the humans might be less volatile knowing they are on a ship full of them, Imada breathed. Precisely. Nezu practically purred with satisfaction. Clearly he was prepared to combat any complaints. Despite these facts, Aizawa was not swayed. That's a plan that hinges on too many maybes, Nizit. And again I appreciate your dedication to the safety of our dear cadets. But Aizawa, you know I am not one to act recklessly without thought. The odds of this going in our favor? Well, let's just say I have done a lot to reach this conclusion that you don't know about. We will also be more than prepared for the worst-case scenario. Seeing the four-eyed glare the partis still pinned to him Nizit tacked on, I would not put them in this situation if I thought they could not handle it. You know this? The headmaster would not budge on this. That was clear. For whatever reason his boss was convinced this reckless act was in all of their best interests. Unfortunately, there wasn't much Aizawa could do to stop him. Nezu's position gave him a great deal of power and influence. Defying his orders was no small feat and changing his mind was even harder. Thankfully there was rarely ever a reason to try and defy him. Though unorthodox, Nezu was not malicious. At least not to his subordinates and cadets. It was an illogical risk, but Aizawa was simply going to have to grit his teeth and see it through. Fine. But if anything happens to my students I will personally see to it that you are held accountable. He rumbled out all whilst discreetly seeking out Imada's hand and resting his own next to it. The familiar pressure and warmth of his friend helped soothe his frustrations. The call ended shortly after that. Nezu told them to call once the new translator was delivered and they had woken the human, heavily implying they should wake the human should the calm arrive before he wakes. The headmaster was definitely pushing this along as fast as he could, which was understandable in some ways, but mostly just stressful. Silence had fallen over the medical ward immediately after the call. Aizawa hardly noticed the passage of time as he and Imada sat there in the kind of quiet one could only really achieve with a close companion. Both had taken to staring at their wards, studying each minute twitch and sigh the human maid in particular. An unspoken offer lingered in the air. Aizawa could practically hear Imada saying, "You can talk to me about what happened on that smuggling ship when you are ready. I'm here for you." Despite his loud demeanor, Imada was good at pulling back and accommodating for Aizawa's more reticent nature. That didn't mean the Yekali wouldn't get pushy if he felt Aizawa was actively avoiding it. Because he absolutely would. The yellow nuisance just liked to give him a chance to be the one who initiated those talks. It was an illusion of choice, really. Aizawa knew that technically the experience he just had would be considered traumatic by some sentients. In his honest opinion, being kidnapped by smugglers probably didn't even make his top 10. It was an awful experience, of that there was no doubt. But being a peacekeeper means you volunteer to get into some nasty situations, and Aizawa had long since made his peace with that. He was really only concerned about Eri, Katsuki, and Izuku. Unfortunately, the chances of convincing Imada to feel the same way were basically less than 0%. Maybe he could convince the humans to hide him until the Yekali forgot about this whole ordeal. It was scary how attractive that plan sounded for about 5 pulsecs. Aizawa might need to be worried about Izuku's human nonsense being contagious. They were shaken back to the present by a rapid knock on the infirmary door. Neither instructor had a chance to call out or answer the door before it slid open to reveal the dark, almost black, galaxy purple of Gyro. Like usual, her posture was slightly hunched and probably not very proper, but Aizawa was hardly one to reprimand her for something like that. It was always a little odd seeing her and Imada so close together as they were practically each other's antithesis. Despite both being Yekali, it was easier to find what made them different than try to draw comparisons between the two. Their protofeathers were almost quite literally night and day. Gyro's antenna-like sensory organs and ears were also noticeably longer, with a long chain that connected the 2 ears on one side of her face and dangled down to her Cittsah. She also had additional antenna-like organs that limply hung and framed her face. Really, the only similarity between the two, aside from traits common with their species, is that neither was particularly broad. In her taloned hand, Gyro clutched a translation device that looked somewhat similar to the one the human wore, though clearly not of human engineering. "Where's Denki?" Imada chirped. With a put-upon look, Gyro shifted to one leg, using the other to kick at something, or someone, they couldn't see just behind the door frame. There was a short yelp followed by a small rounded snout that peeked around the wall. The 4 vent-like nostrils that rest atop the snout flared with each rapid inhale. It was followed quickly by the rest Denki in all of his golden yellow glory. The shiny metallic quills that lined the top of his head and down his spine, a staple of the Zaxatar species, rattled with unease. They could see the nervous static that jumped from quill to quill from here. The charge traveled up the 6 zigzagging antenna-like appendages that rest upon his head, causing their droplet-shaped ends to glow dimly. That glow was matched by his wide yellow eyes that stared skittishly at the human. The black bolt-like marking that covered one of his eyes stretched lightly from his exaggerated expression. "It's like, not gonna attack us, right?" the Zaxatar said in what Aizawa would hesitate to call a whisper. Realistically, it's probably the closest Denki probably could get to whispering. With a huff, Aizawa turned away from them. "You're probably fine." He truly did believe that too. With Aizawa around to reassure him, Izuku would likely be delighted to meet more sentients. Izuku just exuded a curious and friendly youngling energy when he wasn't convinced he needed to fight for survival. Gyro didn't appear to need any further reassuring, promptly walking into the room to deliver their package. "Here is the translator. It's a fairly standard issue, so I won't waste your time giving you instructions you already know. Denki and I loaded it with the most recent and comprehensive translation programs for the human language. This model should also fit the human fine if the notes we were given are right. Nez, you took a look at it too before approving it?" She extended the comm to Aizawa, the small matte gray device only slightly peeking out from her hand. He didn't keep her waiting, neatly retrieving the device and holding it up for a cursory inspection. Much like the comm device Izuku's mother had, this model was meant to connect to a sentient with an external ear structure. It hooked onto the ear and had thin wires that connected to a piece that secured to the sentient's neck to help make sure the earpieces weren't lost if they got dislodged. The section that secured to the neck also helped detect and translate what the speaker was saying into the desired language. That information was then transmitted to nearby devices either broadly or selectively. Any desired sentient with a comm could hear what was being said, and really most sentients were equipped with one at almost all times. Aizawa and his colleagues were never without one, though theirs were much more discreet than Izuku's. Really only a select few, many humans among them, opted out of carrying one around constantly. Typically, the translation could reliably mimic the speaker's actual voice so well that you would hardly notice the difference between them. There was also virtually no delay in translation. At least not one slow enough to be detectable by sentients. Imada had once explained to Aizawa how the things managed to translate in real time without anticipating incorrect words, but he had long forgotten half of what was said then. Something about the translator not just relying on sound but also on biometric readings of the specific species that was speaking in order to predict what was being said as it was being said? Despite its innocuous appearance, the translator was an amalgam of sophisticated sensors and programming that were honestly kind of scary sometimes. Nodding in approval, Aizawa glanced over to Denki. He was still not so subtly hiding at the doorway. "Where are your classmates?" he asked. "Headmaster Nezu told us all to go to the rec area," Denki answered. The youngling shuffled for a moment before tacking on, "Sir, is it true what he said? That we are going to make contact with a human ship?" There was an obvious fear in his voice. No doubt fueled by the countless contradicting rumors that circled humans. It made it impossible for the younglings to know what to expect from this encounter. The only reliable source the class had was Katsuki, who had actually spent time with Izuku. The trinitrox was far from delicate and probably only exacerbated the growing unease. It was only experience that prevented Aizawa from reacting negatively to the question. He's glad Nezu had the decency to brief his cadets. But being faced with the clear toll it's having on one of them was strong. They weren't old enough to be put in the middle of such a tense situation. They barely had any in the field experience, and for good reason. They were simply too young. The Pardus was not one to coddle his cadets, but now was one of those rare occasions where he felt it was needed. Aizawa passed the device over to Imada, then ushered Gyro into the hall. As the door slid shut behind him, he took the moment to really observe the two. Denki was hunched in on himself, looking up at him beseechingly. Even Gyro, now shedding the bravado she put on in front of the sleeping human, was looking distinctly uncomfortable. A gentle hand was laid on both of his cadets' shoulders and Aizawa hunched slightly to get closer to their level. When he spoke, there was the soothing rumble of a purr in his voice. "I'm sorry that I wasn't there when you all were briefed on what is going on. It must have been scary enough thinking you might have lost a classmate and teacher to smugglers. I had to be here in the med bay though. That human you just saw? He's just as much a victim as anyone else in this whole mess." Aizawa paused, letting them digest the information before forging onward. Part of the fear many had of humans came from the sense of otherness that was often associated with the species. He needed them to see him as another sentient and not an active threat. The Pardus' next words were picked carefully. "His name is Izuku, and he's a youngling. I don't know how old exactly, but my best guess is he would be around your age. He was kidnapped too, but the difference is he doesn't have anybody right now. How would you feel in his position? Separated from your family and surrounded by strangers you didn't know. It's our duty as peacekeepers to help him get home because wouldn't you want someone to do the same for you? But how do you know they aren't just going to attack us? That he won't just attack us?" I heard the calm chatter. "I know what the humans did to the smugglers," Denki challenged. Aizawa very pointedly does not let them know what Izuku did to Imada within pulsecs of waking. "Then you should also know that the humans only targeted the smugglers. They freed the prisoners. Izuku acted the same way. He didn't threaten us once. In fact, he went out of his way to help us," the instructor said in return. "The humans have shown us that they are really only interested in punishing those who have directly wronged them. We haven't done anything like that. You can't be positive they'll assume we are innocent in all this," Gyro cut in. Nodding, Aizawa agreed. "That's right. You can't guarantee an outcome in any situation. As peacekeepers we must always be prepared. But we have Izuku and I can tell you he will vouch for us. Even when we couldn't communicate with him, Izuku was kind to us on that smuggling ship. He treated us like we were part of his pack. I have faith in him and so I need you to trust me and do the same. Have faith but prepare for complications." His students leaned into his hands, eyeing him critically as they mulled over his words. It was easy to see the tension that still vibrated in their muscles. Though it appears to have lessened for now. Was Aizawa projecting more confidence in this situation than he really had? Absolutely. But that was what his students needed right now. They needed the reassurance of their guardian and Aizawa would not deny them that. If he had his way with this, his students won't even be within shouting distance of a human. But just in case he had to make sure they felt comfortable enough to not self-sabotage with their own nerves in the event they are faced with one. "Now then," the Pardus said, straightening his spine and removing his hands. The transition from caretaker to commander was smooth. Though he liked to pretend otherwise, Aizawa cared deeply for all of his cadets. In many ways they were like his own younglings despite not being related by BLD. To their credit, his cadets adapted to the sudden change quickly. Their own posture stiffened slightly as they stood at something closer to attention. "Has Skio already taken care of any inoculations that might need renewing for contact with humans?" "I know she's already taken care of Katsuki, Eri, and I." The conversation devolved into basic procedure from there. Going over what Skio had done to prepare the cadets, something he would also go over with her again when she came to check on Izuku before their dreaded contact with the humans. Briefing students again to make sure Nezuyu covered what they needed to do should the humans prove less friendly. Double-checking they knew which section of the ship to stay in. Although Denki's attention was beginning to lag, he stuck it out. Aizawa was proud he had managed to last as long as he had. He had been working with the Zaxatar with managing his attention struggles since he became his instructor. While Denki still had bad days, overall he had been improving a great deal. It helps that Gyro was with him. She tended to be good at keeping him on track and reminding him of things he had forgotten. Time seemed to move in fast forward from then on. Even being limited to the med bay as he was, Aizawa was busy. organizing with Nizu as they got closer to making contact with the humans with each passing pool note. Eri, still resting, was moved to wait with the rest of the cadets far from where the humans would be allowed. After much debate, Imada was convinced to abandon Aizawa in the medbay. He was only persuaded to leave by pointing out someone needed to watch over the students directly. At some point the headmaster had his way onto the ship as well. Aizawa honestly had no clue when he had arrived, but he had joined Aizawa with the resting human to work out the final details. There was also the pressing issue of how exactly the human managed to summon his mother in the first place. Even with how hectic their whole escape was, Aizawa distinctly remembered the human fidgeting with something in their escape pod. It was only after a careful and quiet search that they found what Izuku had used. Hidden in a small discreet pocket, whose opening was concealed by the seam inside of a primary pocket in the human's jacket, was a small device. It was fairly diminutive, probably only about as big as Izuku's thumb. The design itself was rather innocuous in appearance as well. At a glance it looked like trash. A miscellaneous piece off of some undeterminable object. This appearance is probably why it didn't get confiscated. It could also be because their captors didn't bother to thoroughly search the human. Only upon closer inspection you would find that it was much more than it appeared. The device was essentially some kind of beacon, obviously of human make. Reluctantly Aizawa had conceded to Nizu more closely inspecting it. To his credit the headmaster was careful to not activate it on accident, but that didn't stop Aizawa from anxiously clenching his teeth every time the principal so much as touched it. Scans found that on its own the device was capable of emitting a short-range emergency signal for other humans to pick up on. Presumably this signal was targeted at a specific group. However, the humans had also designed it to be able to utilize a ship's systems to reach much longer ranges. It was almost surprising the humans had made it capable of syncing with other sentient ships and signals. But it was likely a choice born of the paranoia they had when interacting with literally any other sentient species. Their inspection rapidly ate up any remaining time, and all too soon the time had come. They watched as Skio delicately roused their resident human youngling, urging him to sit up for another inspection. The impending contact they would be making loomed over them like a storm cloud. While the medic fussed Aizawa silently showed the comm device to Izuku. Considering they had seen Izuku's mother with one, he was fairly certain the human would know exactly what it was. His assumptions were proved correct when the human seemed to, based on his limited knowledge on human expressions, instantly light up. Izuku pointed at the device, then to himself in question. Yes. Aizawa affirmed, extending his arm further. Izuku bore his teeth with the human delight Aizawa was quickly becoming accustomed to and reached out to retrieve the device. The youngling's hands were still a little clumsy. Once dexterous digits were now fumbling stiffly. Izuku bashfully turned to him when it became clear he would not be able to fasten it himself. At least not in a timely fashion. Without even realizing what he was doing, Aizawa reached out to help. His clawed hands gently adjusted the straps around the human's neck. He was mindful, keeping his touch light as he adjusted the device and tilted Izuku's head as needed. It was only when his mind caught up with his body's actions that he realized just how close Izuku had allowed him to get to his neck. This level of trust to a practical stranger was usually unheard. Yet here he was, deadly claws only a hair's breadth from the youngling's throat, and the human hadn't even twitched. Instead, wide green eyes stared up at him. The happy curve of his lips remained firmly in place, despite the barriers that separated them. The vast, some would say unnavigable, chasms of species, language, and culture that carved perilous furrows between them. Undeterred by all of that, this little one sat showing not a hint of a doubt in Aizawa's intentions. Unable to help himself, the Pardus chuffed softly at the human as he pulled his hands away. He forced himself to be distracted with the device as it brought itself to life. The brief flicker of a light signifying its activation, then another brief flash of another light to show it was ready to go. There was some mild amusement urging him to chuff again as he watched the youngling try to crane his neck and look down at what his new comm was doing. The Pardus restrained himself though. Then Aizawa found himself hesitating for a brief moment. Something about saying his first actual words to this human suddenly felt so heavy. Only a handful of cycles ago this youngling was a complete stranger. But now it didn't quite feel right to still think of them that way. Kind of strong to still consider someone who helped save your younglings' lives as just a stranger. It didn't feel right just saying anything that came to mind. No, the first thing he wanted to say was something he hadn't had the chance to yet in all the chaos. Izuku, thank you. The youngling paused. Tilting his head he uttered, huh? Now that the human had rested some, and he wasn't actively trying to rip out the throats of his enemies. It became apparent how soft his voice was. It had a much higher pitch than the tone he used to spit unintelligible vitriol at their captors with. His voice was almost shy, a faint hint of breath as if he was nervous about being too loud. It was a little jarring when compared to younglings like Katsuki, whose gruff raspy tone was akin to the rumble of a detonation. I said thank you, Aizawa repeated patiently. You helped me get Katsuki and Eri off that smuggler ship safely. If you hadn't helped us, I'm not sure I could have gotten them out of there without one of them getting seriously hurt, or worse. The human's cheeks turned a little red. No, I didn't do much at all. Kaken got us out of that cell and if it weren't for you guys I never would have gotten off the ship. And if you hadn't stepped up when you did we might have gotten hurt trying to get the resources we needed to escape the cell. We might have been unable to defend Eri. Or worse, they might have managed to separate her from us, the older of the two gently corrected. We are all very thankful for what you did and I'm pretty sure you have become Eri's personal hero. Just please try not to help others at the expense of yourself again. Maybe learn to give yourself some credit while you are at it too. The longer he spoke, the redder the human's face got. His arms shot up with ill-advised speed, what with his current injuries, and wrapped themselves around his head. He also made a sound akin to a dying animal. Were Aizawa not familiar with the dramatics of younglings, he might have been alarmed by the sound. But he was maybe 80% positive that the sound wasn't a cause for concern. No, Well, you guys. Izuku couldn't seem to settle on what he wanted to say. He did seem sure he didn't want to leave the safety of his arms though. They were still firmly wrapped around his head, rather ineffectively hiding his face. You aren't going to convince me that you don't deserve our gratitude. You were very brave, kid. You deserve some recognition. Aizawa shifted in his chair, tapping at his comm device to dismiss the incoming notifications from Nezu. The headmaster could stand to wait a few poolnuts. You also deserve proper care to help you recover. I don't need to worry about you turning red, right? Last time you collapsed you changed colors. Are you having some kind of episode? The human whined again. No. Well, I mean sometimes it's a bad thing when someone turns. But like not all the time? Like if we have a fever What are you doing? Izuku watched wide-eyed as Aizawa raised slightly to loom over the human, reaching out a hand to feel at the human's head. The Pardus purred reassuringly as the pads of his fingers pressed gently against the youngling's cheek. I don't know if I trust your own estimations of your well-being. I don't know a human's usual temperature, but you aren't as warm as you were earlier. He was interrupted when Izuku stiffened suddenly. The youngling's eyes widened almost as if he just realized something, and he heard the human whisper, with about as much subtlety as Dinky, Tito beans? Then he promptly slapped his hands over his mouth. There was a brief, maybe slightly confused silence, and then, what does that? Why are you turning redder? Are you actually getting sick? No. I'm fine, I promise, the human shrieked. There was a long pause and Aizawa could practically feel the human begging him to ignore whatever that was. So do I need to worry about The average human temperature is 37 degrees Celsius, Izuku blurted out, interrupting Aizawa. That's nice and all, but I have no clue what Celsius is. I don't have a fever. Aizawa squinted with suspicion, but he allowed the subject to drop for now. The Pardus flicked his tail in irritation when he felt the buzz of Nezu trying to contact him again. He dismissed the notification, feeling a small bit of resentful joy at causing the headmaster some minor inconvenience for the dupu he was putting them through. Aizawa wanted to reunite Izuku with his people as well, but he wasn't about to just sweep the kid up in a stressful whirlwind of a plan. He could broach the topic delicately to make sure this reunion wasn't bogged down by discomfort. Izuku began, interrupting his brief moment of inattention. Have you seen my panic button? Or Izuku could do it for him. Aizawa had a sneaking suspicion he knew exactly what the panic button was. It certainly was a button and it certainly caused some panic. Still, he asked, panic button? It's a little device about this big. The human gestured with his hands. It was in my pocket, but I don't know where it is now. I need it to get home. It's what you used to send that distress signal, right? The Pardus inquired. His tone wasn't accusatory, simply trying to confirm his suspicions. Izuku perked up, so utterly oblivious to the terror his actions caused. It was a painful reminder of the human's youth. Honestly, the more he interacted with the human, the more baffled he was that he hadn't picked up on the human's age. Yeah, that. I have to turn it on again to make sure it's traceable. They have to be losing their minds right now trying to find me, and I don't want them to worry. I'm positive it did its job. Aizawa shot back dryly. Oh, have you already contacted the Magnolia? Did you talk to my mom? Is she okay? There was a tinge of desperate worry in the human's tone again that melted Aizawa's heart a little bit. It wasn't really surprising that Izuku was asking about getting home. In fact, it was more odd that the youngling had waited this long to broach the topic. However, how does one delicately tell a youngling that their mother is definitely doing okay? So okay, in fact, that she was actively terrorizing your captors and is now prowling around somewhere in this sector trying to find her kit. Also that we are sort of terrified that she will find us and do unspeakable things. So maybe please don't use your button again and rile her up even more. No, we haven't contacted her yet. She sent out a warning to our captors in response to your signal. But we have been waiting for you to be awake so you could make that call with us. We didn't want your mother to misunderstand our intentions. Izuku seemed genuinely confused at that statement. My mom isn't xenophobic, she wouldn't assume you're bad just cause you aren't human. I mean, she's a little protective, but my mom is the nicest person you'll ever meet. You'll love her, I promise. It was only through sheer force of will that Aizawa managed to suppress his immediate sarcastic rebuttal of, I sincerely doubt that. There was youthful innocence and then there was, whatever the crack sort of denial this youngling had going on. Nice? The human he watched assault a sentient and then promised disturbingly creative acts of violence is who Izuku would describe as nice? Brutal is definitely the descriptor Aizawa would pick. It's definitely no mystery as to where the youngling got his fierceness from. In the absence of an answer, Izuku plowed onward. His eagerness, bordering on desperation, was more than palpable. Though he could hardly be blamed for that. Anyone would be frantically trying to return to their loved ones in a situation like this. Does that mean we can call her now? I want to make sure she knows I'm okay. When she gets worried, she doesn't take care of herself, you know. I need to make sure everyone else is safe too. We can call her as soon as Aizawa was interrupted when the door to the infirmary opened. Both Izuku and the Pardus jolted at the sudden sound as Nezu sauntered into the room like he owned the place. Which he sort of did, but it still felt a little rude. As soon as I arrive. Hello, the headmaster chimed in. I assumed since you weren't responding then that must mean the human was awake. Nezu turned to Izuku and conspiratorially stage whispered, Aizawa is an excellent instructor, but he can be a little petty when he's upset. Instructor? Izuku mumbled to himself as the headmaster climbed up onto the chair previously inhabited by Imada. Yes, instructor. Nezu declared without actually clarifying. We can talk more about that later. All you need to know is that I'm the headmaster of this fine fleet, so my presence is needed in delicate situations that require proper officials. And ensuring a youngling is returned to their family is indeed a delicate situation. Izuku glanced uncertainly at Aizawa. Clearly, Nezu was making the youngling uncomfortable, which was not an uncommon sentiment for most sentients when they meet him for the first time. He was a bit disorienting, practically a force of nature in the eyes of some. It seemed prudent that Aizawa give the youngling another comforting rumble. Despite not seeming to be a common human sound, Izuku seemed to like the noises he made well enough. It worked somewhat too since Izuku relaxed a little, subtly shifting so he was closer to Aizawa's chair at the head of the bed. The human, in a rare absence of stubbornness, allowed the subject to drop and instead hesitantly mumbled, Does that mean we can call my mom now? A shudder ran down Aizawa's spine when Nezu mimicked the chapich expression they had learned from the human, revealing his sharp little teeth. His scheming eyes squinted jovially as he tried to properly mimic the gesture. Why Izuku, the headmaster chirred, I could hardly deny you such a simple request.